have a godly heritage? Indeed it does. Abundant documentary evidence of that fact is available in tens of thousands of historic documents. In fact, the history in and around just this one building clearly demonstrates America's godly heritage. This is Independence Hall in Philadelphia, the birthplace of American liberty and the cradle of American constitutional government. It was here on July the 2nd, 1776, that our founding fathers in the Continental Congress approved a complete separation from Great Britain. It was 2 days later, on the 4th of July, that they approved the Declaration of Independence, and then 4 days after that, on the 8th of July, they took that new declaration, they walked outside, they stood on the steps of Independence Hall, and they read that new declaration to the crowd that was assembled around the building. They then rang this bell, the famous Liberty Bell. Now, most folks assume that this is called the Liberty Bell because it rang when America announces liberty, but that's not the case. It's called the Liberty Bell because of the Bible verse from Leviticus 25:10 that's emblazoned around the top of the bell.
Proclaim liberty throughout the land to all the inhabitants thereof.
This Bible verse accurately describes what happened on July the 8th, 1776, when liberty was announced to the people and the Liberty Bell was rung to proclaim liberty throughout the land. Right around the corner from Independence Hall and the Liberty Bell is this building. This is Carpenter's Hall. This is the building in which the very first American Congress met, even 2 years before they declared independence. In 1774, as the 13 colonies saw the approaching conflict with Great Britain, 40 of America's leading statesmen gathered here in preparation for that coming conflict. Those 40 luminaries included individuals such as Patrick Henry, John Adams, George Washington, John Jay, Samuel Adams, and many others. Now, most of those 40 had never met each other before they gathered here, so when they assembled here for the first time, what'd they do? They opened with prayer, right here. But it was not a dinky little superficial type of prayer like might be prayed at a public gathering today. No, it was a profound time of prayer. It was led by the Reverend Jacob Duché, a nearby minister from local Christ Church just a couple blocks away. This is the Reverend Jacob Duché's church. This is Christ Church. This is the church where many of the founding fathers worshiped and where many of them are buried. In fact, there are 7 signers of the Declaration buried here, including Benjamin Franklin, Benjamin Rush, James Wilson, Robert Morris, and Francis Hopkinson. And signers George Ross and Joseph Hughes are also buried here. So many founders worshiped here at Christ Church that around 1910, a famous stained glass window, now called Patriot's Window, was added to the church, showing many of the founders and famous Americans who attended here. Shown in the window are Robert Morris and his family. Robert Morris was one of the elite group of 6 founding fathers who signed both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. There's also George Washington and his wife, Martha. And Alexander Hamilton, a signer of the Constitution and an author of the Federalist Papers. And Dr. Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration and the father of public schools under the Constitution. And here is Joseph Hopkinson, a federal judge and a constitutional attorney who was the son of signer of the Declaration, Francis Hopkinson. In fact, here is signer Francis Hopkinson with another of his sons. And this is John Penn and his family. And this is Benjamin Franklin and his daughter Sarah. Franklin is another of the 6 who signed both the Declaration and the Constitution. He was also governor of Pennsylvania after the Revolution. Not only did Franklin attend church here, but this is pew number 70, which Benjamin Franklin held in this church for 60 years. This is the pew where he and his family sat when attending church here. And this is pew number 58, where George and Martha Washington sat while attending church during the 7 years that he resided in Philadelphia as President of the United States. This is pew number 52, where Robert Morris sat during services. Pew number 60 is where John Penn sat. And pew number 65 is the pew of Francis Hopkinson, who played the organ here in this church and is responsible for this work from 1767. This is America's first purely American hymn book. It was from Christ Church that the Reverend Jacob Duché came here to Carpenter's Hall to open the very first American Congress with prayer. Of that time of prayer, John Adams reported,
"The Reverend Duché, unexpectedly to everybody, struck out into an extemporary prayer which filled the bosom of every man present. I must confess I never heard a better prayer, with such fervor, such ardor, such earnestness and pathos, and in language so elegant and sublime for America and for the Congress. It has had an excellent effect upon everybody here.
Silas Deane, who became a famous American diplomat, was also a member of that first Congress, and he said that it was, quote,
a prayer worth riding 100 miles to hear.
That is, it was worth spending 3 days on horseback to arrive in time for that prayer. So profound was the prayer that Deane reported, quote,
even Quakers shed tears.
In addition to the momentous time of prayer that morning, Congress also read from 4 chapters in the Bible. One of those chapters, Psalm 35, had particularly impacted the group. As John Adams reported to his wife Abigail,
I never saw a greater effect upon an audience. It seemed as if heaven had ordained that psalm to be read on the morning. I must beg you to read that psalm.
Numerous other delegates also commented on that profound time of prayer and Bible study here at Carpenter's Hall, which is yet another clear reminder of America's godly heritage. After that first year when Congress met in Carpenter's Hall, the next year they met here in Independence Hall. This is the room that for several years was the home of the Continental Congress. The Congress that produced so many of our famous founding fathers and great national leaders and military generals and U.S. presidents. In fact, America's first 4 presidents all served in Congress in this room. An interesting anecdote involving one of those 4 occurred here in 1777. John Adams of Massachusetts, who went on to become America's 2nd president, became close friends with Dr. Benjamin Rush from here in Philadelphia while both were serving here in Congress during the Revolution. Both had signed the Declaration of Independence together. Dr. Rush, known as the father of American medicine, had been appointed by Congress as the Surgeon General of the Continental Army. In 1777, he traveled the battlefield hospitals, helping the wounded and checking on the medical conditions before returning to Congress. In 1777, the American Revolution was not going particularly well. America was losing many more battles than it was winning. At this time, with the outlook so bleak and the war going so poorly, Dr. Rush returned to Congress and in this room leaned over to John Adams and asked him if he thought that we could actually win the revolution. Adams' answer was clear and unequivocal. He simply replied,
Yes, if we fear God and repent of our sins.
Most Americans have never heard this account, but it's another part of our godly heritage, and it's characteristic of the tone so often manifested by Congress in this room. In fact, the Continental Congress issued 15 separate prayer proclamations during the Revolution, calling the country to days of prayer and fasting or prayer and thanksgiving, depending on the specific circumstances at that time. In fact, here are 3 of those original prayer proclamations. These are 3 of the 15, and these and the others were characterized by explicitly Christian language. And recall John Hancock, the president of the Continental Congress who presided over Congress in this very room? He signed the Declaration of Independence with his big, bold signature. He went on to become the first governor of Massachusetts. And here is a prayer proclamation that he issued. Notice that this is for a day of public humiliation, fasting, and prayer, and is characterized by explicitly Christian language. Hancock issued nearly 24 such proclamations. Calls to prayer, including the many calls issued by the Continental Congress in this room, were a frequent occurrence during the American Revolution. But this is another part of America's godly heritage of which few Americans today have ever heard. Just as the Declaration of Independence was approved and signed in this room in 1776, so too, 11 years later in 1787, the U.S. Constitution was written and signed in this room. But few today know that virtually every one of the 55 founding fathers who framed the U.S. Constitution were members of Orthodox Christian churches, and many were outspoken evangelical Christians. Few today know that of the 56 founding fathers who signed the Declaration of Independence in this room, nearly half had received degrees from schools that today would be considered seminaries or Bible schools. Few today know that it was signers of the Declaration of Independence who started the Sunday school movement, as well as numerous Bible societies and missionary societies. And signers of the Declaration were also responsible for penning numerous religious works and publishing several famous Bibles, including this one, America's very first family Bible, and also this one. This is the first translation of the Greek Septuagint into English. And then there is this one. This is the first stereotyped or mass-produced Bible in America, and all of them were done by signers of the Declaration of Independence. As a matter of fact, This Bible from 1782 is an important part of the history of this very room in Independence Hall. Before the Revolution, when we were still British citizens, it had been illegal to print English language Bibles here in America. We used only those Bibles that the King approved. But with the final American victory over the British at Yorktown, we were finally free of that policy. Robert Aiken, a local printer, therefore approached Congress asking permission to print English language Bibles on his presses here in Philadelphia. He pointed out to Congress that the Bible would be, quote,
a neat edition of the Holy Scriptures for the use of schools.
Congress approved his request and appointed a congressional committee to oversee the project. In late summer 1782, the committee reported back to Congress that the Bible was ready to print. And so, on September the 12th, 1782, Congress, in this room, officially approved that Bible. It soon began rolling off the presses, and this is the final product. Originally, some 20,000 of these Bibles were printed, but today only about 30 are left in existence. This is now one of the rarest books in the world. This is the first English language Bible ever printed in America, and in the front of this Bible is a congressional endorsement declaring,
whereupon resolved that the United States in Congress assembled recommend this edition of the Bible to the inhabitants of the United States.
This famous Bible for the use of our schools is the product of the action of Congress in this very room. Concerning this specific event and the Bible it produced, one early historian observed,
who, in view of this fact, will call in question the assertion that this is a Bible nation? Who will charge the government with indifference to religion when the first Congress of the States assumed all the rights and performed all the duties of a Bible society long before such an institution had an existence in the world?
Indeed. Congress itself was America's very first Bible society. These are just a few of the many examples of America's rich, godly heritage. Another well-documented part of America's godly heritage that few know today involves George Washington. Significantly, George Washington served in this room as a member of the Continental Congress in 1775. And it was here that he was chosen to become the Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. 12 years later, in 1787, he served in this room again as President of the Constitutional Convention, presiding over the writing of the U.S. Constitution. These facts are well known. However, there's a long, famous, but now forgotten account of the young George Washington that appeared in school textbooks for generations. It involves a military battle in which George Washington's life hung in the balance for over 2 hours, but was miraculously spared. In fact, Washington himself openly acknowledged that it was only by the direct intervention of God that he had remained alive. The incident transpired in America's French and Indian War, which occurred in the 1750s, some 20 years before the American Revolution. At that time, both England and France, two long-standing bitter enemies that had fought each other for centuries in Europe, they were both claiming the same land in America along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. They went to war to settle that dispute, and those living in America at the time took sides, with most of the Indians joining with the French and most of the American colonists joining with the British. Great Britain, seeking to drive the French from the inland parts of America, dispatched some 2,000 hand-picked veteran British troops to the colonies. Those troops, under the command of distinguished General Edward Braddock, arrived in Virginia and were joined by 100 Virginia buckskins led by their 23-year-old Colonel George Washington. Braddock then set out for the mouth of the Ohio River to expel the French from Fort Duquesne, which is now the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Having traveled hundreds of miles, Braddock arrived here in western Maryland, where he temporarily halted the troops and constructed Fort Cumberland on the very location where this church now sits. Even though he was still more than 100 miles from Fort Duquesne, Fort Cumberland would serve as a staging ground for the attack. Fort Cumberland no longer exists today, But this is Fort Necessity, which was built by George Washington the year before Braddock came to America, when George Washington had led Virginia's military forces in an unsuccessful attack against the French at Fort Duquesne. Well, even though Fort Cumberland no longer exists, this gives you a good idea of how it would have appeared at the time. From Fort Cumberland, Braddock dispatched his force in several ways. First, he sent out 700 as an engineering force with axemen and military protection to open a road through the wilderness. Next came Braddock, George Washington, the Virginians, and 1,200 chosen British troops. This was the principal military force. Last came the baggage and heavy equipment wagons, bringing up the rear with some 400 soldiers. Several weeks later, on July the 9th, 1755, Braddock's forces had reached this very point. This is now Braddock, Pennsylvania, but it was only 7 miles from the French fort. While following a pathway through these woods, they walked into a waiting ambush. Right here, the French and the Indians opened fire on them from both sides. But not to worry.
Front line of battle!
Braddock's troops were battle-hardened British veterans. They were accustomed to war. Unfortunately, they were veterans of European wars. And in Europe, warfare was traditionally conducted on an open battlefield. One army lined up at one end of the open field, the other army lined up at the other end of the open field. They looked at each other, they took aim, and they fired. No running, no hiding. Everyone stayed in the open. When the 700 troops in that advance party came under attack, they turned and fled and ran directly into the 1,200 troops behind them that were still advancing, created mass confusion, and it ended up that most of the battle took place right here in these woods. From these trees, the Indians were shooting down on the British. From behind these rocks, they were shooting at the British. From under logs, they were shooting at the British. The British had no clue what to do. In fact, when they came under fire in the ambush, they did exactly what they'd been trained to do. They didn't run, they didn't seek shelter, they simply lined up shoulder to shoulder along the bottom of the ravine, and they were promptly slaughtered. In fact, over the next 2 hours, of the 1,300 British and American troops, 714, more than half of them, were shot down. Only 30 of the French and Indians were shot, and most of those were by Washington, Virginia buckskins, who were accustomed to woodland warfare and who had taken cover when the attack began. Even among the officers, the British losses had been enormous. Of the 86 British and American officers in that battle, 26 were killed and 36 more wounded. George Washington was the only mounted officer not shot down off his horse. He was the only remaining officer left on horseback. And he had been particularly vulnerable because throughout the battle, he had courageously ridden back and forth along the front line of the troops, delivering General Braddock's orders first here and then there. Late in the battle, General Braddock was seriously wounded. Washington took charge, gathered the remaining troops, and led them back to Fort Cumberland. Along the way, Braddock died. And on his death, Washington performed the role of military chaplain, reading the funeral service, offering prayers, and reading scriptures. Braddock's body was then buried here, and wagons were driven over his grave so that the Indians could not find his body and desecrate his remains. Washington and the remaining troops arrived back at Fort Cumberland on July the 17th, 1755. During the week-long march back to the fort, word had spread across the colonies that the slaughter of the British and American forces had been complete, that the entire force had been wiped out. So after his safe arrival at the fort, Washington wrote a letter to his family assuring them that despite the reports to the contrary, he was still very much alive. He told them,
"As I have heard since my arrival at this place a circumstantial account of my death and dying speech, I take this early opportunity of contradicting both, and of assuring you that I now exist and appear in the land of the living."
Washington assured his family that he was indeed alive, but just barely. He explained that after the battle was over, he had taken off his jacket and had found 4 bullet holes through it, yet not a single bullet had touched him. And he had horses shot from under him, but he had not been scratched. Washington therefore told them,
"I now exist and appear in the land of the living by the miraculous care of Providence that protected me beyond all human expectation."
As word of God's protection of Washington spread across the colonies, the Reverend Samuel Davies even mentioned it in this sermon, preached just a few weeks after the battle. By the way, Davies was a leader in the American revival known as the Great Awakening, and he was considered the greatest pulpit preacher in America. In this 1755 sermon, the Reverend Davies expressed his belief that God's special intervention in behalf of Washington during that battle suggested that God probably had something special planned for Washington in the future. Of course, 20 years later, it was apparent that God definitely did have something special planned for George Washington, and the entire nation has benefited as a result. Additional evidence of God's miraculous and direct intervention in that 1755 battle was provided 15 years later in 1770, which was then the time of peace. George Washington returned to the area near where he had earlier battled the French and Indians. An old Indian chief from far away, having learned of Washington's return, traveled across the state to meet with Washington. The ancient leather-faced chief sat down with Washington and face-to-face over a council fire explained that he had been a leader in that battle 15 years earlier, and that during the battle he had instructed his braves to single out the officers and shoot them down, knowing that if he could slaughter the officers, they could scatter the remaining troops and then easily destroy them later. Washington, like the other officers, had been specifically singled out, but after dozens of unsuccessful attempts by the warriors to shoot him down, the chief concluded that Washington was under the care of the Great Spirit, and he instructed his braves to cease firing at him. He told Washington,
"I have traveled a long and weary path, that I might see the young warrior of the great battle. I am come to pay homage to the man who is the particular favorite of heaven, and who can never die in battle."
Significantly, others from that battle provided identical testimony. For example, another chief testified,
"Washington was never born to be killed by a bullet. I had 17 fair fires at him with my rifle, and after all could not bring him to the ground." Clearly,
God's intervention in the preservation of George Washington was apparent both to his foes as well as to his friends. Today, a huge memorial to George Washington has been erected to commemorate the site of that battle. What would have been the impact on America had Washington been shot down in 1755? Nearly 2 centuries later, President Calvin Coolidge answered that question, declaring,
Washington was the directing spirit without which there would have been no independence, no union, no constitution, and no republic. We cannot yet estimate him. We can only indicate our reverence for him and thank the divine providence which kept him to serve and inspire his fellow man.
Significantly, even Washington understood that he had played a critical role in America's formation, but he also recognized that it had not been the result of his own skills, but rather the favor of God, as he humbly acknowledged,
"I have only been an instrument in the hands of Providence."
The remarkable account of God's direct intervention in the life and affairs of one of our greatest national heroes appeared in American history textbooks for nearly a century and a half. It's a well-documented part of our godly heritage, but today, this account is virtually unknown. In fact, today we're often told just the opposite, that America had no godly heritage, and that our founding fathers were atheists and agnostics and deists who formed a completely secular government. However, a clear declaration by founding father John Adams proves otherwise. John Adams declared,
"The general principles on which the fathers achieved independence were the general principles of Christianity."
That declaration by John Adams is exactly the opposite of what we hear today. Yet Adams was an eyewitness. He knew what our foundation was. In fact, he helped construct it. There's abundant evidence proving that the general principles of Christianity were indeed firmly embraced by the vast majority of our founding fathers, and that those principles form the foundation of American government. In addition to the proof that's readily available in the founders' own writings and public acts, additional confirmation is also found in what many today might consider a surprising source, the publications of the American Tract Society. Known for publishing gospel tracts and literature, the American Tract Society was formed in the early 1800s. In 1813, they bound their individual tracts together to make these volumes of gospel tracts. It's fascinating to read these old Bible tracts and the messages they contain, but it's even more fascinating to note that several of these gospel tracts were penned by founding fathers who drafted our founding documents. Yet considering the educational system and the textbooks that produced our great leaders, it's not surprising that so many of them were Christians and were outspoken about the importance of Christian principles in American government. Here's a prime example. One early textbook that had great influence was the New England Primer. First introduced in Boston in 1690, this was a school book from which Americans learned to read until 1930. It was a beginning textbook in education, or what we today would call a first grade textbook. Not only were many of the Founding Fathers raised on this textbook, but they even reprinted it to make sure that it was available for children in their generation. Samuel Adams reprinted the primer for students in Massachusetts. Benjamin Franklin reprinted it for students in Pennsylvania, and Noah Webster reprinted it for students in Connecticut. What did it contain? Well, after introducing students to the alphabet, it presented a special section to be memorized, a section in which each letter of the alphabet was accompanied by a Bible verse. A wise son makes a glad father, but a foolish son is the heaviness of his mother. Proverbs 10:1. B, better is a little with fear of the Lord than great treasure and trouble therewith. Proverbs 15:16. C, come unto Christ, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and he will give you rest. Matthew 11:28. And on it continues. And this alphabet was memorized by American students for over 2 centuries. And in the back of this little book were more than 100 questions for students, including, what's the 5th commandment? What's forbidden in the 5th commandment? What's required in the 6th commandment? What's forbidden in the 6th commandment? There were dozens of similar Bible-oriented questions, and this textbook was a foundation in American public education for over 2 centuries. Students educated under this philosophy, so inculcated with biblical principles, were frequently characterized by what many today would consider exceptional achievements at a very young age. For example, during the American Revolution, when John Quincy Adams was only 11 years old, he was assigned to be the official secretary to his father, John Adams, America's ambassador to the British court of St. James. And at the tender age of 14, John Quincy Adams was appointed to be the official diplomatic secretary to Francis Dana, America's ambassador to Russia. Can you imagine sending a 14-year-old today to help represent the United States in Russia? John Quincy Adams clearly began his service for America while very young, and his distinguished political career spanned nearly 7 decades. Following his service in the American Revolution, he served as a foreign ambassador under Presidents George Washington, John Adams, and James Madison. In fact, George Washington called him
the most valuable public character we have abroad.
John Quincy Adams was also a U.S. Senator under President Thomas Jefferson. He was Secretary of State under President James Monroe, and then he became the nation's 6th president. He finished his career with an additional 17 years in the U.S. House of Representatives. This is an address that a very elderly John Quincy Adams delivered on the 4th of July in 1837, 61 years after the Declaration had been signed. Having been an eyewitness and a participant in the birth of America, he had been selected as a keynote speaker at a large patriotic celebration where he delivered this address. Adams began by asking the crowd a simple question.
Why is it that, next to the birthday of the Savior of the world, your most joyous and most venerated festival returns on this day, on the 4th of July?
An interesting question. Why is it that the 4th of July and Christmas were America's top 2 holidays? John Quincy Adams answered that question.
Is it not that in the chain of human events, the birthday of the nation is indissolubly linked with the birthday of the Savior? That it forms a leading event in the progress of the gospel dispensation? Is it not that the Declaration of Independence first organized the social compact on the foundation of the Redeemer's mission upon earth? That it laid the cornerstone of human government upon the first precepts of Christianity?
According to John Quincy Adams, on the 4th of July, 1776, the Founding Fathers had taken the principles that came into the world through the birth of Christ and used those principles to birth the nation, thus joining together Christian principles and civil government in what he called an indissoluble bond. Today, however, we're told just the opposite. We're told that the founders didn't want an indissoluble bond, but that instead they wanted a so-called separation, that they wanted biblical principles kept out of civil government. But that's not what Adams said, and he was an eyewitness to the American Revolution and served during the American founding. He knew what he'd seen and what he and the other founders had done. And other founders were equally outspoken about the importance of maintaining Christian principles in, not out of the civil arena. Consider, for example, John Jay. John Jay served in Independence Hall as the president of the Continental Congress in 1778. He was also one of 3 founding fathers who drafted and signed the peace treaty with Great Britain to end the American Revolution and establish America as an independent nation. Once the U.S. Constitution was written, Jay was an author of the Federalist Papers. He's considered one of the 3 men most responsible for the adoption of the Constitution. And when George Washington became president, Jay served first as his first Secretary of State and then was appointed as the original Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. In fact, when the Federal Congress sat here in Philadelphia before moving to its permanent home in Washington, D.C., John Jay was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court when it met in this room, inside Old City Hall, the building located next door to Independence Hall. For almost a decade, this was a home of the U.S. Supreme Court, and it was in this very room that John Jay presided over the early United States Supreme Court. Chief Justice John Jay clearly believed that Christian principles should be included in the civil arena. In fact, here is a newspaper from 1792 documenting the fact that ministers came into the courtroom and opened the court with prayer and prayed over juries before they went out to consider the legal issues placed before them by John Jay or other of the justices. In fact, on this particular day, the Reverend Dr. Parker offered the prayer, and Vice President John Adams was in attendance, present for that day's prayer and John Jay's charge to the jury. Clearly, John Jay did not want religious principles or expressions separated from the public arena. In fact, he forcefully declared,
Providence has given to our people the choice of their rulers, and it is the duty as well as the privilege and interest of our Christian nation to select and prefer Christians for their rulers.
President George Washington also urged the incorporation of religious principles throughout the public arena. This book is an original from 1796. This is his famous farewell address in which he announced to Congress and the nation that he was retiring from public office after serving 2 terms as president. By the way, of the 8 years that Washington was president, for 7 of them, he lived just outside Independence Hall in what was called the President's House, and he was living there when he delivered this address. In its original handwritten format, the address was delivered to Congress while they still met here in Philadelphia. That address was promptly published in newspapers across the nation, such as this one from September the 21st, 1796. For generations, Washington's farewell address was considered so important and its content so profound, it appeared in this format, as a separate standalone textbook. Students were taught that this address was the most significant political speech ever delivered to the nation, and they were even tested on its content. Yet in recent decades, Washington's farewell address has largely disappeared from American textbooks. Why? Apparently it has way too much religious content for today's often secular-minded educrats. How religious is Washington's farewell address? Well, in explaining why the American political system had been so successful, Washington specifically singled out what he considered to be the 2 most important elements of American government.
Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism, who should labor to subvert these great pillars.
Washington specifically identified religion and morality as the 2 most important elements of American government. And he even warned that anyone who attempted to separate those 2 elements from the political realm could not be considered an American patriot. We certainly don't hear those types of statements anymore, but such were the succinct declarations of America's founders. Clearly, the system of government given to us by our founding fathers was deliberately and intentionally built upon religion and morality, and it has enjoyed unprecedented success. We are now the world's longest ongoing constitutional republic. To exist more than 2 centuries under the same governing document is an accomplishment unknown among contemporary nations. For example, Russia, Italy, France, Greece, Haiti, and many other nations underwent revolutions at about the same time as the American Revolution, but with very different results. In fact, during the same period that America has had just 1 government, France has had 15. And in just the 20th century alone, Russia had 4, Afghanistan 5, Poland 7, and the same pattern is true with other nations. Each of those nations, when forming their governments, had access to the same set of political philosophies. Yet our founding fathers apparently selected ideas that the other nations chose not to apply. So what were the sources for the founders' successful ideas? Political science professors believe that they could answer this question. If they could assemble a broad spectrum of writings from the founding era and see who or what was being quoted in those writings, then they could identify the source for many of the unique political ideas embraced during the founding era. The researchers therefore assembled 15,000 representative writings from that period, searched those writings, and isolated 3,154 direct quotes. They traced those quotes back to their original sources, thereby identifying the most frequently cited sources of the founding era. The result is recorded here in this work, The Origins of American Constitutionalism. The researchers discovered that the single individual cited most often during the founding era was political philosopher Charles Montesquieu, with 8.3% of the quotes being taken from his writings from the 1750s. Legal scholar William Blackstone was the second most cited individual, with 7.9% of the quotes being taken from his writings in the 1760s. And political philosopher and theologian John Locke was third, with 2.9% of the quotes being taken from his writings in the 1680s and 1690s. These were the three most frequently cited individuals during the founding era. But the researchers discovered that the single most cited source was the Bible, with 34% of the quotes being taken from the Scriptures. Significantly, that percentage is even higher when the source of the ideas used by individuals such as Montesquieu and Blackstone and Locke are identified and included. Consider, for example, a primary source of Blackstone's ideas. This massive set is Blackstone's most famous work, his Commentaries on the Laws. First introduced in 1766, this became the final word in American courts, and it remained a primary legal source until well into the 20th century. This was used to define words, establish procedure, and settle disputes. So what was a primary source for Blackstone's ideas? The answer is evident when going through his works, but the testimony of Charles Finney also provides a clear indication. Finney, a university president, educator, and civil rights leader, was probably best known for being a famous preacher during one of America's great revivals, the Second Great Awakening of the early 1800s. In his autobiography, Finney recounted his early desire to become an attorney. So like all other law students at that time, he began studying Blackstone's commentaries. As Blackstone covered the various legal concepts, he frequently presented the biblical ideas on which the laws were based. Finney stated that in the process of studying Blackstone, he read so much of the Bible that he became a Christian and received his call to the ministry. Clearly, a major source of Blackstone's ideas was the Bible. And a survey of the writings of Montesquieu and Locke confirms a similar and sometimes even a stronger biblical influence on their writings. So while 34% of the quotes in the representative writings of the founding era came directly from the Bible, many of the other quotes were taken from writers who, like Blackstone, had used the Bible to help arrive at their own conclusions. The Bible was far and away the most influential source of ideas in the founding era. It is therefore not surprising that the Constitution reflects many biblical principles. For example, Isaiah 33:22 sets forth three distinct branches of government, just as was adopted in the Constitution. And the logic for the separation of powers was based on teachings derived from Jeremiah 17:9, and the basis of tax exemptions for churches. Exemptions given us by the founding fathers themselves can be found in Ezra 7:24, and there are many other examples of American government adopting biblical patterns and precedents. In fact, the biblical underpinnings of America were so obvious to previous generations that in 1892, even the U.S. Supreme Court had no difficulty in rendering a unanimous decision with what may be a surprising declaration for us today.
No purpose of action against religion can be imputed to any legislation, state or national, because this is a religious people. This is a Christian nation.
This is a Christian nation. What would lead the U.S. Supreme Court to conclude that? The answer is simple: America's own history. The court's decision in that case was only 16 pages long, but in those 16 pages, the court provided almost 80 different historical precedents proving that America was indeed a Christian nation. The court referenced the Founding Fathers, the acts of Congress and the state governments, previous court decisions, and many other official actions to reach its conclusion that America was indeed a Christian nation. 80 precedents in a case is impressive, but it's also important because courts base their decisions on precedent. This enables them to be consistent from ruling to ruling, thus contributing to a stable society. Significantly, that 1892 court decision was by no means the only Supreme Court decision that recognized and preserved America's biblical heritage. Similar decisions were rendered both before and after that 1892 ruling. For example, in 1844, a case was brought before the Supreme Court involving this Philadelphia school. Originally founded by a wealthy French immigrant, he wanted it operated on the secular philosophy dominant in France during the French Enlightenment, and the same philosophy embraced by many schools today. Run by the city of Philadelphia, this school operated on the notion that students could successfully learn morality apart from the Bible. In fact, the school even adopted a policy prohibiting Christian ministers from setting foot on campus. This policy, perceived as an attempt to keep the Bible from students, became an issue at the U.S. Supreme Court. And when the court issued its final decision, the ruling was unanimous and was delivered by Justice Joseph Story, called a father of American jurisprudence, who was placed on the court by President James Madison. In that unanimous decision, the Supreme Court made this declaration that's very surprising today.
Why may not the Bible, and especially the New Testament, be read and taught as divine revelation in the schools? Its general precepts expounded, its evidences explained, and its glorious principles of morality inculcated. Where can the purest principles of morality be learned so clearly, so perfectly, as from the New Testament?
The Supreme Court of the United States unanimously held that this government-run school should teach the Bible, the source of what it called, quote, the purest principles of morality. Modern rulings are exactly the opposite, but few today realize that earlier courts whose justices were appointed by Founding Fathers, have already ruled on the same issues. There are literally dozens of such rulings, including one by the 1811 New York Supreme Court, a ruling subsequently cited by the U.S. Supreme Court as an authority for its own decisions. That New York case dealt with a man who had distributed a writing full of vulgar, malicious, and gratuitous profanity, attacking God, Jesus Christ, and the Bible. He was fined and punished, and on appeal, the state Supreme Court upheld the conviction, stressing,
whatever strikes at the root of Christianity tends manifestly to the dissolution of civil government.
According to the court, an attack on Christianity was an attack on the foundation of our country and its government, and the U.S. Supreme Court agreed. Significantly, none of these court decisions, or scores of others like them, was a problem with the First Amendment, because previous generations understood that the First Amendment was never intended to separate biblical principles or expressions from the public square. Today, we so often hear the Constitution's religion clauses in the First Amendment coupled with the phrase separation of church and state. Yet concerning religion, the First Amendment only states,
Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof.
Clearly, neither the word separation, nor church, nor state is found in any part of the First Amendment. In fact, that phrase appears in no governmental founding document. Of course, most today recognize the phrase separation of church and state, but few know its source. Yet it is important to understand the origins of that phrase and how it subsequently became somehow attached to the First Amendment. Significantly, the 90 Founding Fathers who framed the First Amendment expressed a very clear intent for that amendment, an intent recorded here in the records of Congress. The debates surrounding the framing of the First Amendment ran from June the 7th through September the 25th of 1789, and the records of those debates make unequivocally clear that the First Amendment's purpose was to limit the federal government in two specific areas. First, the federal government was prohibited from establishing a national denomination, whether Catholic, Anglican, or any other. This was the very problem that America had faced when she was part of Great Britain. The British government could decree an official denomination to which all citizens must belong and then punish those who refused. The founders did not want that in America. The part of the First Amendment that forbids any such national denomination is called the Establishment Clause, and it is the part stating, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Secondly, the First Amendment also prohibited the federal government from interfering with or limiting the people's religious expressions. This part of the First Amendment is called the Free Exercise Clause. It's the part stating or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Through the Free Exercise Clause, the federal government was required to protect and not suppress, as it currently does, public religious expressions. In short, because of the Free Exercise Clause, the federal government could not prohibit the people's free exercise of religion, whether expressed privately or publicly. Significantly, both religion clauses of the First Amendment were to limit the federal government and not the people. That is, first, the government could not establish any national religious conformity, and second, the government could not stop public religious expressions, but had to protect them. This is the extent of the First Amendment's religion clauses. And not only does the phrase separation of church and state not appear in any part of that amendment, but significantly, according to the official records of the entire debate on that amendment, the phrase separation of church and state never even came up during the months of discussions over that amendment. Not one single framer ever mentioned that phrase throughout the entire official discussion. It does seem that if separation of church and state had been their great intent for the First Amendment, somebody, one of those 90, surely would have said something about it. But no one did. Not a single word said about it. What then is the origin of the phrase separation of church and state that today so many consider? It's a phrase that appeared in a private letter penned by Thomas Jefferson 13 years after the First Amendment had been written. Throughout his life, Thomas Jefferson had proven himself to be a firm friend of religious liberty. In fact, before the Revolution, in his own state of Virginia, he had fought for freedom of public religious expression for Baptists, Quakers, Presbyterians, and others who were not part of the British state-established Anglican Church. In various colonies prior to the Revolution, non-Anglican ministers had actually been severely persecuted and even been put to death for preaching the gospel without permission of the state-established church. Therefore, founding fathers such as Jefferson, as well as Patrick Henry and James Madison and George Washington and George Mason and others, they fought for the rights of religious expression for all Christians, including the Baptists. They fought for this right before America separated from Great Britain, and they continued to do so afterwards. Years later, in 1801, Jefferson became the nation's third president. And not surprisingly, the Baptists were elated. After all, a man who had proven himself their champion at the state level was now the national leader. Jefferson received letters of congratulations from Baptist groups across the country, including one from the Baptists of Danbury, Connecticut, congratulating him on his victory, celebrating his election as president, and offering their prayers for him. However, they also expressed their concern that the government might restrict their public religious expressions. They believed that freedom of religion was a God-given inalienable right, and that the government should be powerless to restrict religious activities unless, as they explained, those activities cause someone to, quote, work ill to his neighbor. That is, unless someone's religious expression actually directly harms someone else. Jefferson understood their concern, for he had already proven that it was his concern as well. He replied to the Danbury Baptists on January the 1st, 1802, thanking them for their kind prayers and assuring them that their free exercise of religion was indeed an inalienable right and therefore would not be meddled with by the government. Jefferson pointed out to them that there was, quote, a wall of separation between church and state, and that this wall of separation would prevent the government from interfering with or hindering religious activities. Jefferson, like the other founders, fully understood that the purpose of the First Amendment was to protect rather than prevent public religious expressions, and that this is what separation of church and state meant. Here's an example. In 1853, half a century after Jefferson had written that phrase, a group petitioned Congress urging them to separate Christian principles from government, with chaplains being turned out of Congress and the military, and Christian principles being removed from government in the official public square. They desired a so-called separation of church and state, but in the wrong direction. That is, instead of the government protecting religious expressions in the public arena because of separation, they wanted the government to remove religious expressions. Congress spent a year investigating that possibility and then emphatically rejected it, declaring,
Had the people, the Founding Fathers, during the Revolution had a suspicion of any attempt to war against Christianity, that revolution would have been strangled in its cradle. At the time of the adoption of the Constitution and the amendments, the universal sentiment was that Christianity should be encouraged, but not any one denomination. In this age, there is no substitute for Christianity. That was the religion of the founders of the Republic, and they expected it to remain the religion of their descendants.
In short, there was no way Congress was going to use the First Amendment and consequently its so-called separation of church and state to secularize the public square. As they clearly affirmed, the intent of the framers had been just the opposite. In fact, 2 years later, Congress reiterated,
"The great vital and conservative element in our system, that is, the thing that holds our system together, is the belief of our people in the pure doctrines and divine truths of the gospel of Jesus Christ."
That was Congress. Congress clearly refused to separate Christian principles from the public arena. However, it was not just Congress that refused to do so. The Supreme Court refused to do so as well. In an 1878 case, more than 3/4 of a century after Jefferson had penned his separation letter, the plaintiffs in that case invoked his separation of church and state phrase, hoping to use it to their advantage. However, that Supreme Court was not content to let them get by with just using the 8-word separation phrase out of context from Jefferson's letter, which, by the way, is what courts today do. No, rather than just cite the single phrase, the Supreme Court reprinted a lengthy segment from Jefferson's letter to prove that separation of church and state was intended to protect rather than remove Christian values and practices from public policy. The courts maintained that position for the next 7 decades. Then, in 1947, a radical change occurred. In the case Everson versus Board of Education, the court cited only Jefferson's separation metaphor, ignoring the rest of his letter and its clear context. It therefore boldly announced a new policy.
The First Amendment has erected a wall between church and state. That wall must be kept high and impregnable. We could not approve the slightest breach.
This was a brand new philosophy for the court. No longer would Jefferson's separation phrase protect public religious expressions, as it had for the previous century and a half. It would now become a mandate to exclude religious expressions and to secularize the public square. Significantly, as courts and secularists began to remove public religious expressions, they simultaneously clamored separation of church and state, claiming this is what the founders wanted. This was their great intent. So often have they repeated the separation phrase when talking about the First Amendment that many citizens today now believe that the phrase is actually part of the First Amendment, thus demonstrating the truth of a statement attributed to Dr. William James, the father of modern psychology.
There is nothing so absurd, but if you repeat it often enough, people will believe it.
Today's courts, in dealing with First Amendment issues, now repeat the separation phrase more often than they do the First Amendment itself. In fact, since 1947, the separation phrase has been cited in over 4,000 court cases, but the First Amendment's been cited in less than 3,000. In short, the courts have now elevated a single phrase from a private letter, a phrase completely reversed from its original meaning, above the actual language of the First Amendment itself. The Supreme Court, having announced its new approach in 1947, first nationally implemented the policy of public secularism in 1962 when, for the first time in American history, it ordered the separation of religious principles from education, ruling that it was unconstitutional for a student to pray voluntarily, to say a voluntary prayer at school. So revolutionary was this decision that the following year, even the court itself acknowledged that this decision had been without precedent. However, the court's hostility toward voluntary prayer did not stop with that first decision. No, the courts continued to push the prohibition wider and wider and wider until, by 1985, the Supreme Court had even declared that it was unconstitutional for a student to pray a silent voluntary prayer at school. Now, frankly, I don't know how they know if someone is praying silently. I mean, after all, many silent prayers occur with heads lifted and eyes open. So how does the court know when to enforce the ban on silent prayer? Nevertheless, the hostility was such that the U.S. Supreme Court even declared that permitting silent voluntary student prayer was unconstitutional. In the landmark 1962 case, The court achieved its reversal of the Constitution's protection for religious expressions first by using the phrase separation of church and state without regard to its historical meaning, and then by redefining the meaning of a single word within the separation phrase, the word church. For nearly 2 centuries prior to that case, the word church in the phrase separation of church and state was defined to mean a federally established national denomination, such as was represented by the Baptists or Catholics or Anglicans or Presbyterians or whatever. However, in 1962, the court decided that the word church would no longer mean a religious institution, it would now mean a religious activity. So instead of the First Amendment being used to prevent the federal government from setting up a national denomination, which voluntary prayer certainly did not do, it now meant that the federal government must not allow a public religious activity, which voluntary prayer certainly was. This was the turning point in the modern interpretation of the First Amendment. And since that time, notice how that virtually every possible genre of traditional religious expression has been forbidden in recent years under this new doctrine. Imagine, for just short of 2 centuries, the First Amendment had prohibited the federal government from halting public religious exercises. But now, somehow, the First Amendment means just the opposite, all because the court took an 8-word phrase from a private letter and twisted and completely reversed its meaning, and then made that phrase a replacement for the clear wording of the Constitution. That 1962 case redefined the First Amendment, and it's notable for other reasons as well, particularly for its use, or lack thereof, of precedents. Recall that when the 1892 Supreme Court unanimously ruled that Christian principles must remain the basis of American laws and institutions, it had offered nearly 80 precedents as a basis for that decision. The 1962 case was just the opposite, providing virtually no precedents to support its removal of voluntary school prayer. The justices on the court were simply ready to move America in a new direction. So in essence, they simply announced, "We'll not have voluntary prayer in schools anymore. We now think that that violates the Constitution." Within 12 months of that original decision, in 2 additional cases, the court reaffirmed its removal of voluntary prayer and then broadened its prohibition to include Bible reading at school. This was an even more radical reversal than the removal of voluntary prayer. Recall from the brief historical survey already presented that the founders relied on the Bible in education. Early textbooks quoted the Bible and used it to help students memorize the alphabet. Congress printed the first English language Bible for the use of our schools, and previous Supreme Courts ruled that government-run schools would teach the Bible. So, when the court banned Bible reading from schools in 1963, on what possible grounds did it justify its decision? If you want to see why the court did what it did, simply read the case for yourself. You can find it online, or you can go to a local law library and read it. And if you do, you'll see that in reaching its decision, the lower court had relied on the testimony of a psychologist who explained the danger of reading the Bible in schools. The Supreme Court then repeated that finding, reporting,
"If portions of the New Testament were read without explanation, they could be and had been psychologically harmful to the child."
That's quite a statement. The court was no longer concerned merely about law and the Constitution, its constitutionally assigned role, but it had now appointed itself as the national child psychologist. In fact, in recent years, justices on the court have described the court's role not only as being amateur psychologists on a, quote, psycho journey, but also as being, quote, a national theology board, and, quote, a super board of education for every school district in the nation. That decision to remove the Bible from schools, just like the decision to ban voluntary prayer, was a reversal of all previous practice and rulings by the court on that issue. The court was simply announcing yet another new policy. In essence, it was just saying the majority of the 9 of us on the court don't want the Bible in schools anymore. Following those 2 landmark rulings, courts continued to expand the new secular mandates outward. For example, in 1967, a federal court declared a 4-line nursery rhyme used by a K-5 kindergarten class to be unconstitutional. The court acknowledged that the word God did not appear anywhere in the nursery rhyme, yet the rhyme was still unconstitutional. Apparently, if someone were to hear the rhyme, he might think that it was talking about God, and that would be unconstitutional. This trend of hostility toward religious expressions continued in case after case, year after year. In fact, by 1980, the Supreme Court even addressed whether students could continue voluntarily to see the Ten Commandments while at school. The court acknowledged that the Ten Commandments in question were passive displays, just one of many pictures at school. That is, a student might see hanging on the wall a picture of George Washington, or a field of flowers, or a lighthouse on a seashore, or student artwork, or the Ten Commandments, or whatever. In fact, here is an original copy of the Ten Commandments that led to the Supreme Court case. They were not part of any curriculum. They passively hung on the wall, and like any other picture, a student could look at them if he wanted to, and if he didn't, he just walked on by. Nevertheless, the Supreme Court ruled that allowing students even voluntarily to see a copy of the Ten Commandments at school was unconstitutional. The Ten Commandments had to come down off the walls. Notice the court's explanation.
If the posted copies of the Ten Commandments are to have any effect at all, it will be to induce the school children to read, meditate upon, perhaps to venerate and obey the commandments. This is not a permissible state objective.
What a statement. We can't let students see the Ten Commandments. If they saw them, they might read them. And if they read them, they might respect them. They might even obey them. You know, things like don't steal and don't kill. That would be unconstitutional. Significantly, generations of American leaders and courts before that ruling had regularly affirmed that the Ten Commandments were the basis of civilized behavior in our society and the foundation for much of our legal code. In fact, speaking about the Ten Commandments, John Adams unequivocally declared,
"If thou shalt not covet and thou shalt not steal were not commandments of heaven, they must be made inviolable precepts in every society before it can be civilized or made free."
This was the clear declaration of John Adams. And by the way, I think he'd qualify as an expert on the First Amendment. After all, he personally oversaw its framing in the U.S. Senate, and his signature is one of only two that appears at the bottom of the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment. And he forcefully asserts that the Ten Commandments must be fundamental precepts of our civil society. Founding Father James Wilson also affirmed the importance of divine law, such as the Ten Commandments. James Wilson was the distinguished founding father who served many years in Independence Hall, signing both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, one of only 6 founders to sign both documents. He was then appointed by President George Washington as an original justice on the U.S. Supreme Court, where he served in the court for its first 9 years, including when it met here in this room next door to Independence Hall. Significantly, James Wilson was the founder of the first organized legal training in America. In fact, these law books contain the lectures he delivered to law students here in Philadelphia while simultaneously serving here as a justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. These are really the first American law school textbooks. James Wilson, having helped write the Constitution and then taught students about it, would certainly know what is and is not constitutional. So did he think that divine laws such as the Ten Commandments, must be kept out of public view? Here's what he clearly explained to students.
Human law must rest its authority ultimately upon the authority of that law which is divine. Far from being rivals or enemies, religion and law are twin sisters, friends, and mutual assistants. Indeed, these two sciences run into each other.
James Wilson certainly did not believe that the Ten Commandments or divine law should be kept from public view, and many other founders made similarly explicit statements. Furthermore, early courts issued literally dozens of rulings citing from the Ten Commandments as a legal authority on numbers of diverse issues. In fact, so clear was the civil recognition of America's reliance on the Ten Commandments that for decades, one was more likely to find a copy of the Ten Commandments hanging in a government building than in a religious one. Yet despite this lengthy history of reliance on the Ten Commandments, the court suddenly held that students could no longer see the teachings that are the basis of our laws. Returning to the 1962 decision that initiated the official hostility toward public religious expressions, the entire controversy had begun over a 22-word voluntary prayer that the court struck down in the Engel Vital case. That little prayer, which led to the end of all school prayer and so many other public religious expressions, had simply stated,
Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee, and we beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country.
That little voluntary prayer, which only acknowledged God and didn't even mention the word Jesus, was so bland that 8 years later it was ascribed by a court as a, quote, to whom it may concern prayer. Now that's bland. That prayer acknowledged God only once, the same number of times that God is acknowledged in the Pledge of Allegiance, and only 1/4 the number of times He's acknowledged in the Declaration of Independence. Yet somehow, that single voluntary acknowledgement was unconstitutional. Since this prayer had merely acknowledged God, the court even went so far as to investigate what percentage of the nation at that time did believe in God. The court reported that only 3% professed no belief in religion, no belief in God. Significantly, 97% of the nation did believe. That 22-word prayer was consistent with the beliefs of nearly all the nation. Yet the court said that it was unconstitutional for students even voluntarily to say what almost the entire nation believed. This was another first by the court. In addition to 1, having ignored the actual wording of the Constitution, 2, having set aside precedent, and 3, then having elevated an 8-word phrase from a private letter above the Constitution itself, the court, having no constitutional basis and nothing more than its own preference, now, 4, sided with the 3% against the 97%. This was the first time in America's history that 3% had become the majority. This decision initiated the current policy whereby the philosophy of the small dissident group, that is the 3%, becomes the standard by which the rest of the nation, that is the 97%, must conduct its public affairs. In the unconstitutional 22-word prayer, there had been 4 categories over which God's blessings had been petitioned. 1, us, that is students. 2, parents, that is families. 3, teachers or schools. And 4, the country or the nation. Significantly, for almost 2 centuries, the courts had used biblical principles in addressing policy issues in all 4 of those areas. For example, in the area of families, courts noted that civil laws made divorce difficult to obtain because the Bible was difficult to obtain. And even 20th century courts pointed out that God, not government, had made marriage and the family. Therefore, government did not have a right to regulate something it hadn't made. Courts even set forth biblical lessons citing Adam and Eve and covering a history of God's dealings with marriage and the family, concluding that since it was God who had created marriage and the family, the court would use His standards in dealing with those areas. The courts similarly applied biblical principles to the other 3 categories as well. But in 1962-63, the Supreme Court reversed that practice. So, did the court's decision to change national policy and expunge God's principles from public affairs have any measurable effect? Statistics seem to indicate that it did, and in ways that the founders themselves had predicted. For example, consider the changes that occurred in the first category, us, that is, students. George Washington, in his farewell address, accurately predicted what would occur if religious principles were separated from students. He specifically warned,
"Let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of impressionable structure, that is, on the minds of students, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle."
Washington warned that excluding religious principles from education and students would result in a loss of morality. Statistics now confirm the accuracy of his warning. Consider the category of pregnancies for unwed teenage girls. For decades prior to 1962-63, birth rates for unwed teen girls had remained relatively stable. But with the court's exclusion of religious principles from students, birth rates for unwed teenage girls immediately skyrocketed by 400%. Similarly, birth rates for junior high girls had also been low. But following the court's removal of religious principles, pregnancies for girls ages 10 through 14 shot up by 460%. America now has the highest teen pregnancy rate of any nation in the industrialized world. Sexually transmitted diseases among students also reached previously unrecorded highs. Notice how low the rates had been. Notice the point where religious principles were removed, and look at the dramatic increase that followed. Strikingly, moral measurements for students broke violently in the wrong direction following the court's 1962-63 policy of enforced secularism. This is a strong correlation. Perhaps it's merely coincidental, but it certainly is clear and striking. Consider the next category in which public policy long maintained the use of biblical principles, the category of our parents, that is, our families. What happened with the exclusion of biblical principles? Consider the area of marital stability. According to federal statistics, the divorce rate had been steadily declining for years and even decades prior to 1962-63. But then notice what happened. Religious principles were excluded from public policy, and the divorce rate skyrocketed. Suddenly, the United States found itself #1 in the world in the divorce rate. Similarly, the number of single-parent families also exploded, reaching almost triple its previous level, and unmarried couples living together increased tenfold, soaring by over 1,000%. In fact, having now excluded biblical principles, some American policymakers even became confused about how to define something as simple as marriage. Was it to remain the union of a man and a woman, or should it become that of a man and a man, or a woman and a woman, or 5 men and a woman, or vice versa? Or is it perhaps an older man and an adolescent girl, or any of the other possible combinations? What remarkable changes have occurred since biblical values were excluded from public policies on the family. The third category over which God's assistance had been petitioned in that unconstitutional prayer was our teachers, that is, our schools. What happened when God and biblical principles were barred from our schools? One excellent indicator is the SAT test, the Scholastic Aptitude Test, an academic test for college-bound high school students that has been used in America since 1926. Prior to 1962-63, SAT scores bounced around the same general level and had been stable for decades. But following the removal of God from education, scores plummeted year after year after year after year. Other school-related statistics showed similar adverse changes. Consider finally the fourth category, that of our country, or the nation. Just from a common sense perspective, what do you think will happen when a policy is adopted that says, you can't see the 10 Commandments, things like don't steal and don't kill? You might obey them. We can't have that. Logic dictates that to exclude such principles and values will affect behavior. Apparently it did. In fact, George Washington, in yet another remarkable insight from his excellent farewell address, accurately predicted what has now occurred.
Let it simply be asked, where is the security for property, for reputation, for life, if the sense of religious obligation desert?
Washington warned that if the sense of religious obligation were separated from the public arena, that there would be no security for life or property, the very things most often touched by violent crime. In America, violent crime had remained stable for decades, but following the removal of religious principles, violent crime soared over 470%, with the United States becoming the world's leader in crimes committed. There are many additional examples of marked changes in national statistical measurements following 1962-63. Significantly, the founders understood that America could prosper only under God's blessings, and therefore refused to separate His principles from any aspect of public affairs. In fact, concerning God's blessings, Benjamin Franklin, right here in Independence Hall, reminded political leaders in his day,
without his concurring aid, we ourselves shall become a reproach and a byword down to future ages.
But the founders understood that in order for God to bestow His blessings, His principles first had to be honored and embraced. George Washington pointed out,
the propitious smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right, which heaven itself has ordained.
In fact, the thought of disregarding what Washington had called God's eternal rules of order and right was a fearful thought for the Founding Fathers. As Thomas Jefferson acknowledged,
I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that His justice cannot sleep forever.
Of course, the founders' reasoning that God will bless or oppose a nation based on the policies it adopts makes sense only if there is a God, only if He has established transcendent rights and wrongs, and only if he responds to a nation on that basis. But if these ifs are true, then it goes a long way toward explaining the correlation so visible on the charts. Obviously, the founders certainly believe these ifs to be true, and they therefore repeatedly stress that God should be openly and publicly acknowledged throughout the civic arena. For example, consider this document. This is the very first federal Thanksgiving proclamation, a proclamation written by President George Washington. In this document, Washington forcefully reminded Americans,
"It is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey His will, to be grateful for His benefits, and humbly to implore His protection and favor."
This is exactly what America did prior to 1962-63. Samuel Adams made a similar declaration.
May every citizen in the country have a proper sense of the deity upon his mind, and an impression of the declaration recorded in the Bible, "Him that honoreth me, I will honor, but he that despiseth me shall be lightly esteemed." 1 Samuel 2:30.
America long guided its public policy with a clear awareness of these principles, fully embracing the belief that when America honored God, God could bless America, but that if America adopted policies that despised God and His standards, His blessings should no longer be expected. This belief stemmed from the principle of national accountability to God. While this concept is not completely unknown today, it's the concept of individual accountability to God that's still widely accepted. Most people believe that someday they will stand before God and answer to Him for their behavior. However, the founders stressed both individual and national accountability, and they also understood a fundamental difference between the two, the difference of when that accountability would occur. They recognized that individuals would answer to God in the future, but that nations would not. That when a nation passed from existence, it was forever gone and would not be resurrected to answer for what it had done. So when does a nation answer to God? That question was answered right here in this room on the floor of the Constitutional Convention in 1787 when George Mason, known as the father of the Bill of Rights, reminded the other delegates,
"As nations cannot be rewarded or punished in the next world, they must be in this. By an inevitable chain of causes and effects, Providence punishes national sins by national calamities."
Other founders echoed the same truth. They believed that God would deal with the nation right now, in the present, for the stands that it takes and the policies it enacts. Understanding the profound consequences of national accountability, the founders were emphatic about keeping in public office those who would enact policies that God could bless. But leaders who honor God's principles are placed into office only when voters themselves first embrace those principles and then apply them as a standard to guide their vote. Therefore, if God-fearing citizens are not involved at the ballot box, then God-fearing leaders will not be elected to office, God-honoring policies will not be enacted, and the result is that the respective city or state or nation will not be blessed by God. This is why Chief Justice John Jay had reminded the voters in his day,
Providence has given to our people the choice of their rulers, and it is the duty as well as the privilege and interest of our Christian nation to select and prefer Christians for their rulers.
In the same vein, the Reverend Charles Finney reminded Christian voters in his day,
"The time has come that Christians must vote for honest men and take consistent ground in politics. Christians have been exceedingly guilty in this manner, but the time has come when they must act differently. Christians seem to act as if they think God does not see what they do in politics, but I tell you, He does see it, and He will bless or curse this nation according to the course Christians take in politics."
Of course, news reporting today rarely mentions whether a candidate running for office embraces or rejects God-fearing and biblical principles. And God-fearing citizens often complain that they don't know what a candidate really believes. Well, thankfully, there are now a number of voter websites available to help identify the specific beliefs of candidates on numbers of important issues, including those related to biblical values. Links to several such websites are available at www.wallbuilders.com. In addition, when a race has a state or a federal incumbent running for re-election, Numerous websites will present the incumbent's voting record, clearly establishing what he's actually done while in office. And by the way, a voting record is always to be believed above a candidate's speeches or campaign ads, for as the old axiom correctly states, actions speak louder than words. God-fearing citizens must become active voters. They must also realize that separation of church and state, as it exists today, is not a teaching of the Founding Fathers. It is not an historical teaching, and it's not a teaching of law until recent years. While we fully support a separation between the two institutions of church and state, that does not mean a separation of values and principles and religious expressions from the public square. Furthermore, because of contemporary court rulings, we need to recognize that there is going to be someone's religion in the schools and in the government. With the courts having rejected traditional meanings, it's led to a number of absurd consequences. For generations, the understanding of what constituted a religion was simple and straightforward. By all definitions, to be a religion required a belief in some supreme being who set forth commands by which he expected his followers to live and conduct their affairs. That is, religion required a belief in the existence of some supreme being who is to be worshipped and obeyed by his followers. Consequently, the term religion could include those of the pagans, or Muslims, or Jews, or Hindus, or Christians, or many others. However, groups that did not acknowledge some type of supreme being were never considered to be religions. But in the early 1960s, when the court decided to change the long-standing meaning of the First Amendment, it also decided to change the long-standing meaning of religion. And just as it wrote its own new First Amendment, it also wrote its own new definition for religion. Under its new definition, a person's religion was whatever he believed so strongly that it affected the way he behaved. As a result, many beliefs and creeds and philosophies that completely denied the existence of any supreme being suddenly became legal religions. Consider a few absurd examples from the many that now exist. Courts now hold that atheism is a religion. But atheism is the essence of anti-religion, so how can anti-religion be a religion? What are the religious beliefs of atheists? Well, atheists believe devoutly that there should be no public religious expressions. So the religion of atheism is the religion of practicing no religious practice. That is, it is religiously practicing non-religion, and the courts now officially consider atheism to be a First Amendment religion entitled to full religious protections. Don't shake your head to clear it just yet. Courts and government officials have also ruled that satanic and Wiccan groups are now religious groups, and that people who give contributions to those groups may receive the same tax deductions as people who give contributions to Christian churches or Jewish synagogues. The courts also consider secular humanism to be a legitimate religion, equivalent under the law to Christianity. But what is the primary belief of the religion of secular humanism? It's the belief that everything revolves around man rather than God. It's a man-centered philosophy that excludes God. There is no belief in any kind of supreme being, yet this is a court-recognized religion. Scientology, begun in the 1950s, is also now an official religion. Its beliefs are simple. It says,
in Scientology, no one is asked to accept anything as belief or on faith. That which is true for you is what you have observed to be true.
The truth in this religion is whatever an individual personally picks and chooses to be true. Scientology is often described as a self-help philosophy. And even though there are dozens of other self-help philosophies and groups across the nation, this one calls itself a religion and thus secures additional court protections. And as a final example, Universalist Unitarianism, formed in 1961, is now recognized as a legal religion. Interestingly, this may be the most comprehensive religion in the world, for it has absolutely no fixed set of beliefs or doctrines. As it explains,
we believe that personal experience, conscience, and reason should be the final authorities in religion, and that in the end, religious authority lies not in a book or person or institution, but in ourselves. We are a non-creedal religion. We do not ask anyone to subscribe to a creed.
Because the primary doctrine of this religion is that every individual may choose whatever he wants to believe, followers of this religion often hold diametrically opposite beliefs on the same issue. Nevertheless, both opposite beliefs are included as part of the official beliefs of this legal religion. Clearly, every individual in America, or for that matter in the world, could qualify to be part of this religion, for all have individual beliefs that stem from their own personal experience. Previously, the beliefs of all of these types of groups were protected by the First Amendment's Free Speech Clause, as well as its Assembly Clause, that is, the right of persons to assemble together. But these groups were not protected by the Constitution's religion clauses. Those clauses existed to protect the truly religious. But now, the constitutional protections for the truly religious have been expanded to include every individual, even the non- and the anti-religious, thereby eradicating the religious protections for the truly religious. Okay, so all of these beliefs and many others are now officially considered religions. That is, Christianity is a religion, as is secularism, atheism, universalism, Scientology, Satanism, and so on. They're all religions. But when is it that the cry of separation from church and state is heard? Are all these religions treated the same? Do social activists enter public schools at Halloween and demand, "Get those witches down off the walls. Witchcraft is a legal, organized religion recognized by the courts. I demand separation of church and state"? Or do they enter schools, look around, and then say, "I don't see any prayer here. I don't see any Bible reading here. As a matter of fact, I don't see any religious practice here"? That means the religion of atheism is being practiced here. The religion of secularism is established here. I demand separation of church and state. Get the religions of atheism and secular humanism out of the schools. Such demands are unknown. So when do we hear separation of church and state? We hear it any time that there's an attempt to involve Judeo-Christian but not other religious principles. That is, not at Halloween, but rather at Thanksgiving and Easter and Christmas. Clearly, there's a double standard. Today's separation of church and state only means that biblical principles must be kept out of public, but not the principles, beliefs, or practices of other religions, or even the so-called religions. Perhaps the clearest demonstration of this fact is evidenced by the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, which has jurisdiction over 7 states and 54 million Americans. That federal court ruled that it was not constitutional for public school students to say, "Under God," in the Pledge of Allegiance, but that it was constitutional for public schools to require a 3-week indoctrination to the Islamic faith in which junior high students must pretend that they're Muslims and they must offer prayers to Allah. Additionally, they're urged to take Islamic names, call each other by those names, wear Islamic garb, participate in jihad games, and read the Quran during those 3 weeks. Significantly, that federal court of appeals did not think that requiring Islamic religious activities violated the so-called separation of church and state, but they believed that voluntarily saying "Under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance did. Courts have also held that classroom libraries may include books on Eastern Oriental religions and Native American religions, but that they must remove books about Christianity. Islamic symbols may be publicly displayed at schools during Islamic holidays, but Christian symbols may not be displayed during Christian holidays, and schools may accommodate the distinct religious dress and clothing preferences of Muslim students, but not of Christian students. Because the courts now define religion to be whatever a person believes so strongly that it affects the way he behaves, the result is that there will never be a time when someone's religious beliefs will not be part of public policy. Therefore, the proper question is no longer whether religious beliefs will be part of public policy, but rather whose religious beliefs will be part of that policy. Will it be the religious beliefs of atheism, secularism, Islam, Eastern mysticism, universalism, self-help Scientology, or a plethora of other religions, creeds, and beliefs? Or will it be the Judeo-Christian religious beliefs upon which the nation was founded and which over 85% of Americans still embrace today? In short, separation of church and state as it exists today is not a teaching of the Founding Fathers or even a historical teaching, but it is the war cry of the modern secularist and anti-biblicist. In America, we've lost much ground in recent years as we've lost our understanding of our own history. We do have a godly heritage in America, but we've been robbed by the 3%, by the secularist and by what is often an all too willing group of public officials and judges who work to establish secularism across the nation. Significantly, however, there are many excellent, God-fearing public officials and judges at all levels of government who do respect and who do work to protect our history and traditional values. But we as voters have become negligent in recent years, and by our own complacency and our own lack of investigation into the beliefs of candidates, we've allowed into public office too many who hold the opposite view. It's time that Americans relearn their own history and refamiliarize themselves with their own governing documents. As Chief Justice John Jay recommended,
every member of the state ought diligently to read and to study the Constitution of his country. By knowing their rights, they will sooner perceive when they are violated and be the better prepared to defend and assert them.
It is also time for Americans to become re-engaged in the civil arena. As John Adams admonished,
we electors have an important constitutional power placed in our hands. It becomes necessary to every citizen, then, to be in some degree a statesman and to examine and judge for himself the political principles and measures. Let us examine them with a sober Christian spirit.
In short, it's time for Americans to recover the things we've given up in recent years. It's time to get involved.
What role should religion play in a free society? More and more people today would answer, none. That would not have been the answer of the founders of the United States, the men who fought the American Revolution and wrote the country's Constitution. To them, the issue of religion and freedom were inextricably linked. You couldn't have freedom without religion. In fact, the political philosophy of the founders necessitated a divine foundation. Thomas Jefferson makes this clear in the Declaration of Independence when he writes that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. The purpose of government, Jefferson and his compatriots believed, was not to bestow rights. Rather, it was to protect those rights already endowed upon human beings by God. But government isn't enough for a free society. A moral people is also required. That is, a people moral enough to police itself. Virtue or morality, George Washington observed, is a necessary spring of popular government. Thus, for the founders, liberty was not merely the ability to do what one wanted. It came with moral demands and boundaries. They all accepted the rule of life expressed by Benjamin Franklin. Nothing brings more pain than too much pleasure, nothing more bondage than too much liberty. The founders knew that the absolute enemy of freedom was, ironically, a freedom that was absolute and unrestrained. And where was this restraint going to come from? Their answer was religion, which for them, because of when and where they lived, was some variety of Christianity. Let divines and philosophers, statesmen and patriots unite, Samuel Adams wrote, in instructing citizens in the art of self-government. In short, of leading them in the study and practice of the exalted virtues of the Christian system. The Christian system to which Adams refers is composed of Judeo-Christian values, the values rooted in the Old and New Testaments, both of which were referred to by the founders with equal conviction and frequency. Jefferson, yes, the very same Thomas Jefferson who is so often portrayed as anti-religious, confirmed this sentiment in his notes on the state of Virginia, when he asked, "Can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God, and that they are not to be violated but with his wrath?" James Madison likewise affirmed the essential connection between religion and morality. The belief in a God all-powerful, wise, and good is essential to the moral order of the world and to the happiness of man. John Adams believed that the doctrine of a supreme, intelligent, wise, almighty sovereign of the universe, a doctrine he credited to Judaism, was the great essential principle of all morality and consequently of all civilization. And he applied this thinking specifically to the new nation he helped to create. Our Constitution, he said, was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. As president, he replied to a letter from university students in a way that would surprise many today. Science, liberty, and religion have an inseparable union. Without their joint influence, no society can be great, flourishing, or happy. Meanwhile, another founder, Alexander Hamilton, looked at the French Revolution and saw something much different. That revolution, unlike the American Revolution, had devolved into violence and chaos. Hamilton believed he understood why. The anti-religious force it unleashed, he wrote, annihilates the foundations of social order and true liberty, confounds all moral distinctions, and substitutes for the mild and beneficent religion of the gospel a gloomy, persecuting, and desolating atheism. For the founders, a free society divorced from religion simply could not work and would not survive. It is no wonder, then, that in his farewell address, George Washington chastised those who would claim to be patriots and yet undermine the influence of religion. Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens. The founders did not demand that anyone believe in any particular religion or even in God. Quite the contrary. But while they understood the value of a secular government, they feared a secular society, one without religion. So should we.
A closer look into our nation's history reveals that our nation's founding fathers were united by their deep spiritual beliefs that shaped the foundation of America. But when our nation's founding fathers established freedom of religion, was it their intent to ban acts of faith in the civil arena? And should our religious freedoms be reserved to the privacy of our homes and churches? Did our founding fathers establish these freedoms to protect public policy from biblical values or to endorse them? And how have America's religious freedoms changed in the past 200 years? America, this is your heritage.
As you look back into American history, you see that the Founding Fathers were very open, very public in expressing their faith. What they did with proclamations, what they did with prayer gatherings and prayer settings, it was not done in private, it was done publicly. And we've come to a real change in America where that we've been taught, particularly over the last 50 years, to compartmentalize our faith. You go to Supreme Court decisions in the early 1960s, and the Supreme Court said, you know, religion is really important in America. Matter of fact, you have a whole First Amendment to guarantee your religion. Right. But what we need you to do is practice that religion at home and at church. We don't need to see it out in public. Now, if you want to pray, pray before you come to school, pray at church, but we don't need prayer with education. And if you like sports, great. Pray at home, pray at church, but we don't need prayer for a football game. And, you know, 10 Commandments, if you want to post that at home or church, do that, but we really don't need it in a courtroom. And a nativity scene, well, that'd look great over your mantle at Christmas time, or put it out in your church foyer, but we don't need a nativity scene at a park. So for 50 years, we've been taught that faith is important, but only if you put it in a private arena. We don't want to see it publicly. Consider next John Hancock. After serving as President of Congress during the Revolution, he was elected governor of Massachusetts, where he issued several proclamations calling the state to prayer and thanksgiving. This particular proclamation is from October the 15th, 1791.
And pray especially that universal happiness can be established in the world, and that all may bow to the scepter of our Lord Jesus Christ, and that the whole earth may be filled with his glory.
John Hancock also issued several other similar proclamations, equally evangelical in nature, but all fully reflective of his own Christian beliefs. This signer is Samuel Adams. Because of his leadership in events like the Boston Tea Party and organizations like the Sons of Liberty, he's been titled the Father of the American Revolution. After achieving victory in the American Revolution, Samuel Adams remained active in political affairs. For example, following the Constitutional Convention, Samuel Adams was one of the individuals responsible for the movement that led to the drafting and the adoption of the Bill of Rights, and he later became the Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts and then as governor. Now, as governor, he issued this 1795 proclamation for prayer, fasting, and thanksgiving. Notice the strong evangelical language he uses throughout.
That the peaceful and glorious reign of our divine Redeemer may be known and enjoyed throughout the whole family of mankind.
This prayer request was often repeated by Adams, as, for example, in his 1797 proclamation,
speedily bringing on that holy and happy period when the kingdom of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ may be everywhere established, and all the people willingly bow to the scepter of him who is the Prince of Peace.
Samuel Adams was a strong and outspoken Christian, a fact revealed in his private writings and confirmed by the official public records. He was such an important leader that he, too, has been honored with an individual statue here at the Capitol, located in East Central Hall. Such proclamations acknowledging God and calling on Him for aid, like these we've already seen from Jonathan Trumbull, John Hancock, and Samuel Adams, were frequent from our founders, not only in their individual state leadership roles, but also in their collective national leadership roles. For example, during the American Revolution, our founders and the Continental Congress issued no less than 15 national prayer proclamations. Those 15 proclamations, each written by different committees of Congress composed of different founding fathers, were all characterized by strong religious biblical language. But why should this be surprising? After all, in the Declaration of Independence, our founders had announced to the world that they were proceeding, quote, with a firm reliance on divine providence, and their numerous prayer proclamations prove that they meant exactly what they said. What's happened is Americans for 50 years have been taught to compartmentalize their faith. They have this thinking that says, faith goes over here, but education's over here. Faith's over here, but business is over here. Faith's over here, but government's over here. We've really segregated faith from all other aspects of life, and the courts have done that very, very largely. As a matter of fact, they've actually arrived at the point where they inflict penalties if you publicly express your faith. There have been a number of federal court suits. It's amazing that the media covers certain things that the courts do, but they cover very little of what relates to religious liberties.
This is an interesting debate because of the fact that we're sitting on public television, okay, and we are being piped through, you know, frequencies that the federal government licensed.
That's right.
You know, and so it's strange that the gospel and the propagation of faith and Christ and His love for people, it never made it over into the Christian broadcasting industry. And that's kind of interesting because they're wanting to compartmentalize, but here we sit today.
But part of it is, it's the Christian broadcasting. It's not broadcasting. Right. So they've already compartmentalized a segment of broadcasting as Christian broadcasting. And so they do that and think, oh, that's the Christian stuff, but the real broadcasting is out here. And so that's one of the things that you see in the battles over cable and who's going to do what on cables. Oh, so it's religious guys. Here's real mainstream TV over here. And so they kind of tolerate. And so what we have, there was a philosophy introduced in the court by Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes. He said, we are under a constitution, but the Constitution is what the court says that it is.
Yikes.
And so that's where we are now. Well, that's not a constitutional violation. Congress made no law. Congress established no religion. By the way, an establishment of religion was defined by the Founding Fathers when they wrote the First Amendment. You can go to the records of Congress. They're online. You can see the entire debate of the 90 Founding Fathers who did the First Amendment. And establishment of religion is very simple. We don't want a national federal denomination. We don't want the federal government to say you all got to be Baptists or Catholics or Anglicans or anything else. That's all it meant. There was nothing about separating God from government, God from public life, nothing. That's why you had free speech. And on top of that, that's why they gave a double security. They said Congress can't stop it, and by the way, you can exercise your faith wherever you want to. Well, that was the security. If you're allowed to exercise your faith where you want to, then Congress certainly can't stop your faith. So it was a double whammy that they put on the Congress. Now we're in the position of saying, well, now wait a minute, you can exercise your faith privately, but not publicly. But the Founding Fathers were into public acknowledgments of God. God was so important to the Founding Fathers that when they met in Congress for the first time in September of 1774, they opened with prayer. But apparently it was not a routine, genteel little prayer like we might pray at a public meeting today. No, according to the writings of those who were there, that time of prayer in Congress was momentous as well as extended. In fact, according to John Adams, Congress not only prayed, but the delegates also studied 4 chapters of the Bible in Congress. That Bible study was so timely and had such a profound effect upon the delegates that John Adams wrote a letter to his wife Abigail telling her,
I never saw a greater effect upon an audience. It seemed as if heaven had ordained that psalm to be read on the morning. I must beg you to read that psalm. Read this letter and the 35th Psalm to your friends. Read it to your father.
By the way, her father was the Reverend William Smith, the pastor of their local church. Silas Deane said this time of prayer and scripture reading in Congress was so powerful that, quote, even the Quakers shed tears. There's no doubt that America has been a successful nation with a stable, successful government because of the foundation on which it was built, a foundation unlike any other nation in the world. In fact, George Washington, in his famous farewell address of 1796, reminded us why our government and its policies were so successful. He declared,
"Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports."
Yet many today, including many Christians, have fallen into believing that Christians should not be involved in civil government, that there should be some sort of a compartmentalization, that our faith should be kept in one arena and real life in another, and that the two should never meet. The Bible does not teach that, and fortunately our founding fathers and early ministers did not believe that.
In today's civil arena, our religious freedoms are often relegated to private acts of worship. But was this our founding fathers' intent? Were these freedoms established to limit religious expression and biblical values in government, or to endorse them? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage Series. America, this is your heritage.
This is the first prayer proclamation ever issued by George Washington. I want to just read you what he said in 1789 in the first federal proclamation for prayer. George Washington wrote this himself. Whereas it is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God. Now, he's not saying do it privately. Right. He's saying it's the duty of nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God. It's the duty of nations to obey His will, to be grateful for His benefits, and humbly to implore His protection and favor. Now, he's not saying that's the duty of individuals. He said that's the duty of nations. Now, the second president, John Adams, this is a famous prayer proclamation that he wrote. He goes a little further on why we do public religious acknowledgement. Here's what he says. He says, as the safety and prosperity of nations ultimately and essentially depend on the protection and the blessing of Almighty God, and as the national acknowledgement of this truth not only is an indispensable duty which the people owe to Him, but a duty whose natural influence is favorable to the promotion of that morality and piety without which social happiness cannot exist. He said it's your duty as a nation to acknowledge God because that produces the social happiness without which we can't exist. Wow. It's your duty to acknowledge God as a nation. He didn't say it individually. He said that's a national duty. Now, you take the third president, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson may have been more pointed than the rest. Just read, this is the first book that Thomas Jefferson ever wrote. This is called Notes on the State of Virginia, written by Thomas Jefferson. And in this section, he has a number of chapters. He calls them queries. This is Query 18. And in Query 18, this is what Thomas Jefferson says. Can the liberties of a nation be thought secure if we remove their only firm basis, which is a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God, that they are not to be violated but with His wrath? He said, indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and His justice won't sleep forever. Now he says, you can't have national liberties if you don't have a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God.
The part that you just dealt with right there, the date now, Dave, in which these documents were written, you're citing from original documents.
That's right.
You're not talking about something you read in a book that was published in the 50s or the 60s or the, you know, you're talking about the words of the guys. So the proclamation would have been issued by Washington in what date? I mean, what are we talking
Well, the date on this proclamation says right here, Saturday, October the 17th, 1789. That's the date of the proclamation. And by the way, this proclamation, now we talked about the First Amendment, how the courts use that to stop religious activity. Yes. You know why this proclamation was given? Because they had just finished writing the First Amendment. They just finished the First Amendment. They said, we need to stop and thank God for what we've just done. Gosh. So our first national Thanksgiving was done the day that they finished writing the First Amendment. The day they approved it, they said, it's time to stop and thank God for what we've done. But this is original from 1789. That is George Washington's first Thanksgiving proclamation, 1789.
Wow. I'm not normally speechless, but that is very profound to me. Yeah. To think of the condition of the way we think. That's right. As opposed to the way the original intent was.
Let me take it a step further, because we're told do religion in private, not public. When you look at proclamations like this, between 1622 and 1815, you have 1,500 proclamations, official proclamations for prayer issued in America. Of those 1,500, 300 are issued by churches, 1,200 are issued by the government. So the government is issuing prayer proclamations at a rate 4 times higher than the churches are. That goes from 1622 to 1815. If you go from 1815 forward, there literally are still thousands more prayer proclamations issued by the government, because we knew, as these proclamations said, it was a national duty which the people owed. It wasn't a private duty. This is something that is substantial, that's necessary for our own happiness as a nation. As Jefferson said, and see, what Jefferson has said is so key. The reason you publicly acknowledge God is because that's the source of your liberties. What's that mean? It's an indispensable truth that if you're going to have inalienable rights, and an inalienable right is defined as a right that God gave you, if you ever lose sight of the fact that your rights come from God, then you lose your rights. See, the right to property is a God-given right, which they talk about. Wow. Well, now we're convinced that it's a court-given right. Yeah. And courts can take it away as they want to, eminent domain, anything else. It's not a God-given right anymore. Perhaps the most famous speech ever delivered by Benjamin Franklin, delivered on Thursday, June the 28th, 1787, on the floor of the Constitutional Convention, Franklin reminded the delegates that we needed God to be our friend, not our enemy. We needed Him to be our ally, not our adversary. We needed to make sure that we kept, as Franklin called it, His concurring aid. Franklin warned, if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without His notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without His aid? He said, we've been assured in the sacred writing that except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. And thus Franklin called for regular daily prayer to make sure that we kept God in the midst of what we were doing in the nation. Jefferson too understood this principle. Jefferson declared, and can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God, that they are not to be violated but with His wrath? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and that His justice cannot sleep forever. A nation does answer to God for the stands it takes.
In today's civil arena, our religious freedoms are often relegated to private acts of worship. But was this our founding fathers' intent? Were these freedoms established to limit religious expression and biblical values in government, or to endorse them? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
On the day they signed the Declaration of Independence, the Founding Fathers underwent an immediate transformation, because the day before, every one of them had been a British citizen living in a British colony with 13 Crown-appointed British state governments. However, when they signed that document and separated from Great Britain, they lost all of their state governments. Consequently, they returned home to their states and began to create new state constitutions. Samuel Adams helped write the Massachusetts Constitution. Benjamin Rush and James Wilson helped write Pennsylvania's Constitution. George Read and Thomas McKean helped write Delaware's Constitution. The same was true in other states as well. By the way, the Supreme Court formally pointed to these state constitutions as precedents to demonstrate the founders' intent. Notice, for example, what Thomas McKean and George Read placed in the Delaware Constitution. Everyone elected or appointed to office shall make and subscribe the following declaration, to wit, I do profess faith in God the Father, and in Jesus Christ, His only Son, and in the Holy Ghost, one God, blessed forevermore, and I do acknowledge the Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testament to be given by divine inspiration. While today we wish this were the requirement for seminary, it was their requirement for politics. Yet notice their emphasis. The focus is on the type of individuals placed into office, not on the type of laws. If you were placed in the position of writing a new constitution for your state, how long would be the document you created? Perhaps it might be similar to the original Oklahoma Constitution. When Oklahoma came into the Union in 1907, its constitution was over 100 pages in length. However, the average constitution written by the Founding Fathers was a mere 5 pages in length, a very short document because the emphasis was on the type of person placed in office rather than on the type of laws. Notice some other state constitutions. For example, the Pennsylvania Constitution, authored by Benjamin Rush and James Wilson, declared, "Each member of the legislature, before he takes his seat, shall make and subscribe the following declaration: I do believe in one God, the creator and governor of the universe, the rewarder of the good and the punisher of the wicked, and I do acknowledge the scriptures of the Old and New Testament to be given by divine inspiration." The Constitution of Massachusetts, authored by Samuel Adams, the father of the American Revolution, stated, "All persons elected must make and subscribe the following declaration: I do declare that I believe the Christian religion and have firm persuasion of its truth." North Carolina's Constitution required that no person who shall deny the being of God, or the truth of the Christian religion, or the divine authority either of the Old or New Testaments, or who shall hold religious principles incompatible with the freedom and safety of the state, shall be capable of holding any office or place of trust or profit in the civil department within this state. What a powerful declaration. You had to believe that God's principles applied to civil government, or they wouldn't let you near public office. You were a dangerous person to have as a leader. This belief of the importance of God-fearing leaders was so well understood in America that in 1892, the Supreme Court pointed out that of the 44 states that were then in the Union, each had some type of God-centered declaration in its constitution.
Okay, I'm still impacted by the words of Washington. Would you just read the first part of that again?
Yes.
Because that, I mean, that document is now over 200 years old.
Well over 200 years.
And it says at the beginning, what was that the first part that you read right there?
He says, "Whereas it is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey His will, to be grateful for His benefits, and humbly to implore His protection and favor."
Wow.
That's the duty of nations.
Wow.
And by the way, I think this man might have a grasp on what is constitutional.
Yeah.
It's just a guess on my part, but since he's the president that did the Constitution, since he did the First Amendment and the Bill of Rights, I think he knows what's constitutional.
I'm picking up on your sarcasm.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, time out. So not only do you quote from original documents, but you are reading from a document right now that's well over 200 years old right now.
Yeah. This is not a duplication. This is the original. We have tens of thousands of the original documents of American history. We don't have to worry about what some professor said Washington said.
Yeah.
We'll go read it right there off of what Washington did.
Wow. So that document in your hand is an original document from what year? 17?
This is dated October the 17th of 1789. That's an original document from 1789.
You're citing from original documents where President, George Washington in this case, and the others, said it is the duty of nations.
That's right.
To acknowledge God.
And now we've arrived at a point where that if you publicly acknowledge God, there's an anti-religious bigotry, and we're told it's required by the Constitution. You can't be a judge and acknowledge God. You can't be a legislator and say something about God publicly. Disqualifies you. And it used to be the duty to you have to recognize that what we have comes from God, including our inalienable rights, our right to life, our right to property, our right to self-defense, our right to liberty. All of that is God-given. If we ever lose that conviction because we stop publicly acknowledging God, then we'll lose all those liberties, all those rights.
Wow.
That's why it was a duty to do it publicly. That's the only way you could keep government under control, was to know that government didn't give me that right, God gave me that right. We're going to keep reminding the public that it's from God.
What were the religious beliefs of the Founding Fathers of the United States? There's been a lot of controversy surrounding this subject, but there shouldn't be. Because of their prominence, I will discuss George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin, our nation's first 3 presidents, and the man referred to as the first American. All of whom, even if some did not individually adhere to Orthodox Christianity, were steeped in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Here's what we can say for certain about their religious beliefs. 1. All of the founders believed in a transcendent God, that is, a creator who exists outside of nature. 2. All the founders believed in a God who imposes moral obligations on human beings. 3. All the founders believed in a God who punishes bad behavior and rewards good behavior in an afterlife. The notion that any of the founders believed in an impersonal deity who merely created the universe and then left it to itself is false. All of them believed in a God who, as Franklin said at the Constitutional Convention, governs in the affairs of men. Let's start with George Washington. Washington's writings, both public and private, are full of references to the Bible. This is certainly true during his 8 years as the first president of the United States. Here is Washington at his first inaugural. The propitious smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right which heaven itself has ordained. In all likelihood, Washington was an Orthodox Christian. Like Washington, Benjamin Franklin also referenced Bible verses, stories, and metaphors throughout his life. His calls for prayer at the Constitutional Convention were typical of his attitude. Franklin, who had his own unorthodox views, summed up his faith this way: that the soul of man is immortal and will be treated with justice in another life, respecting its conduct in this. While the religious views of Washington and Franklin are clear, those of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson are more complicated. Adams referred to himself as a Christian throughout his life, but did not believe in traditional Christian doctrines such as the Trinity or the divinity of Jesus. Nonetheless, before, during, and after his tenure as president, Adams repeatedly asserted his admiration for the Christian faith. Those general principles of Christianity are as eternal and immutable as the existence and attributes of God, he wrote. Likewise, Adams spoke of his great respect for the Bible. The Bible is the best book in the world. It contains more of my philosophy than all the libraries I have seen. Those who suggest that Adams was against religion like to quote from a letter he wrote to Thomas Jefferson, in which he said, "This would be the best of all possible worlds if there was no religion in it." Unfortunately, those who cite this line never quote the lines that immediately follow. But in this exclamation, I should have been as fanatical as the skeptics of religion. Without religion, this world would be something not fit to be mentioned in polite company. I mean hell. So, those who quote the first line without quoting the subsequent lines are either unaware of the full comment or are deliberately misleading people as to Adams's beliefs. Like Adams, Thomas Jefferson did not adhere to orthodox doctrine. Yet he often declared himself to be a Christian. I am a Christian, he said, in the only sense he, Jesus, wished anyone to be, sincerely attached to his doctrines. As one of the leaders of the American Revolution, his views are well known. After all, this is the man who wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You can't get a much more explicit statement of belief than that. These four founders, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Franklin, were practical men with a sober view of human nature. They understood that man is morally weak and that religion provides the best encouragement and incentive to be good. It does so, first and foremost, by teaching that choices have consequences, not necessarily in the here and now, but most certainly in the hereafter, meted out by a just God. It should come as no surprise, then, that Jefferson in his second inaugural asked for the favor of that being in whose hands we are, who led our forefathers as Israel of old from their native land. So what were the religious beliefs of the founders? They were diverse, but all of them were rooted in the Judeo-Christian values found in the Bible. I'm Joshua Charles, writer and researcher at the Museum of the Bible for Prager University.
It is an honor to be with you this morning, and we really have a remarkably blessed history in America. I'm going to share some of that with you this morning, and let me kind of say up front that we've been very blessed in our organization, Wall Builders. We have about 100,000 documents that predate 1812, so I'm going to show you some of those really old documents this morning, but we've got thousands of documents of those who signed the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and documents from black history and constitutional history and church history and military, you name it. And it's a lot of fun to go back and look at that. And so what I want to do this morning and kind of turn in that direction is just remind us that this is really the time of the year when we start to celebrate. But it's also a time when we specifically celebrate what it was that 56 individuals did when they gave us the Declaration of Independence. That declaration is literally the foundation of our government. That is the foundation on which they later erected the Constitution of the United States. And to this day, we continue to hold the Declaration as our foundational document. Right below the Declaration, it holds the Declaration up. Article 7 of the Constitution brings the Constitution right on top of that Declaration. So both documents go together. So when you look at what we have with our form of government that we celebrate every year on our birthday, the 4th of July, it has produced what is now known as American exceptionalism. Now, that term is a term that we don't use much in schools anymore, but it's a term that we used in previous generations. It was a term that was actually introduced back in the 1830s by a man named Alexis de Tocqueville. You may recall Alexis de Tocqueville because he's the guy who did the famous book Democracy in America. What he did was he came to America from 1831 to 1835, traveled across the nation. He was from Europe, he was from France. He said, you know, what those Americans are doing is really special. It's really different. We've never seen any of that kind of stuff here in Europe. Why are they so different? And so he went for 4 years and went all over the nation looking to see what made us different. Went back, and for Europeans and for Frenchmen, he wrote the book to say, here's what's different about America. Here's why they are what they are. And after having looked closely at this nation for 4 years, this is what he said back in the 1830s. He talked about what we call American exceptionalism. He said, the position of the Americans is quite exceptional, and it may be believed that no democratic people will ever be placed in a similar one. We were only 50 years old. He said, man, when I look at what those Americans are doing, it's exceptional. I don't think any other nation will ever do what they've done. So that term American exceptionalism has proven to be an accurate term. As a matter of fact, if you look at where we are today in America, we've had one form of government. That declaration, we've had one form of government. And if you look at other nations in the world, it's been quite different. Same period of time, we've had one form of government. France has had 15 different governments just in the same period of time. If you look even at just the 20th century, Afghanistan had 5 different constitutions in the 20th century. Poland's had 7 since 1921. You've had Russia with 4 since 1917. And you can go through the other nations as well. If you look at the United Nations this year, there's 192 nations at the UN. And that number goes up and down every year. Depends on who conquers whom and who revolts from who and who starts their own nation. 192 nations this year. America is the only nation in the world that does not average a revolution every 30 to 40 years. And we kind of take it for granted. We just assume that stability is natural, and stability is not natural. As a matter of fact, Jesus told us there should be wars and rumors of wars. It was that way when he left. It'll be that way till he gets back. That's normal. What America's experienced is not normal. Now, when you look at this exceptional position we've been placed in, suddenly in America in the last few decades there's been this move that, you know, Europe is the older experienced nation. They've been there for a lot longer than America. Why don't we kind of be like sophisticated Europe? And you know, what they do with government's pretty good, and what they do with civil rights is real good, and what they do with health care is real good. And there's this movement to be kind of like Europe. And we're even seeing it at the U.S. Supreme Court, where Supreme Court justices are quoting what Europe does instead of what America does. Let's be like Europe. Let's do what they do with their laws. You know, 200 years ago, there was the same kind of intellectual elite movement that was going in America that said, hey, let's be like Europe. And at that point in time, Thomas Jefferson addressed that movement. I thought he made a statement that still is applicable today. Thomas Jefferson said this. He said, the comparisons of our government with those of Europe are like a comparison of heaven and hell. Yeah, why would we give up the stability and the prosperity and the exceptionalness that we... And by the way, this is not a comment on American pride. This has nothing to do... We're not blessed in America because we have a 4-syllable word with an A on each end. We've been blessed in America because we've adopted certain principles that God was able to bless across that time. See, that's what we knew made us different from other nations even back then. Andrew Jackson, President of the United States, put his finger on it when he said this. He said, the Bible is the rock on which our republic rests. That's what made us different from other nations. That's why God's been able to bless us in ways that other nations, it's not that God's a respecter of persons. He's not a respecter of nations. Any nation that will use his principles, God will bless. Any person that will use his principles, God will bless that. It's real simple. But America has done that across years. It's just that we've seemed to have forgotten that in our own history. So when you look at this exceptionalism that we've enjoyed today, if we say, well, who are the people responsible for American exception? Who are the people who gave us this independence that we now enjoy? Today, if you look in our textbook, textbooks, you'll find that, well, we credit people like George Washington, and we'll credit people like Thomas Jefferson, and we'll say, you know, John Hancock is certainly one of the leaders. That big, bold signature on the Declaration of Independence is the President of Congress, and we'll say John Adams. And by the way, the cool thing about John Adams is we're kind of rediscovering who he was. David McCullough's book, and now TV specials, miniseries that have been out there. We're kind of rediscovering some of our founding fathers, and these are the folks that we would say, these are the ones responsible for American independence. And that's okay, because they are significant, but what I really find intriguing is when you go back into their writings 200 years ago, and you let them talk about who the leaders were, you get a whole different set of names. As a matter of fact, in 1816, John Adams, 40 years after the American Revolution, looking back on it, we're now an established nation, he said, you know, the people that we look to, the people that we can point to and say they're responsible for American independence, they included people like the Reverend Dr. Samuel Cooper, the Reverend Dr. Jonathan Mayhew. Of course, you had the Reverend George Whitefield. Oh, and there's the Reverend Charles Chauncey. I mean, he went through and listed all these preachers. Now, we don't hear this in any textbooks today, and we might know who Whitefield is, but the chances that we know anything about Cooper or Mayhew, Chauncey, slim to none. Not only do we not study these preachers, we don't study the black preachers who had such an impact in the American founding. We know very little about folks like Richard Allen or Absalom Jones or John Moran or Lemuel Haynes. The huge impact that preachers had in the American founding, black and white, we don't study that today. And while we're on things we don't study, you know, we do know about Paul Revere, the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, that famous poem Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, that ride that Revere, well, Revere was not the only one riding. Now, as a matter of fact, there was another guy riding at that time. His name was Wentworth Cheswell. Wentworth Cheswell was a black patriot. He was elected to office in New Hampshire in 1768. He was a leader in his church. He was reelected in New Hampshire for the next 45 years, held about 9 different political offices in New Hampshire. Well, we didn't know that blacks and whites were both riding, giving the alarm that night. Absolutely. You see, there's so much about American history we don't hear. What we'll usually hear is the negative aspects, and sometimes we say, you know, and particularly in civil rights, we get a Southern view of civil rights. We don't get the other view that was often out there. There are so many patriots we don't hear about today, in addition to folks like Wentworth Cheswell. If you go 6 weeks later over to when we had the Battle of Bunker Hill, you know, the hero of Bunker Hill is right there in the painting. We just don't talk about it anymore, but his name is Peter Salem. Peter Salem right there, and right beside him is David Grosvenor, black and white, fighting side by side in the American Revolution. But Peter Salem is the one who got all the special honors and awards and commendations, more than a dozen different awards from the National Congress, from the State Congress, from his military leaders. I mean, he was the hero. He saved countless American lives that day, but we've never even heard of Peter Salem today. In the same way, we'll see the picture of George Washington crossing the Delaware, but we wouldn't recognize folks like Prince Whipple and Oliver Cromwell, 2 black patriots who served throughout the American Revolution with the general and the general staff throughout the Revolution. Never even heard of those guys. And then if you even move to the last battle of the American Revolution, the Battle of Yorktown, certainly we're going to hear about the young General Marquis de Lafayette, but we don't talk about the other guy standing there right in the painting with him, and that's James Armistead. James Armistead is the hero of Yorktown. He's the first double spy we had in the American Revolution. It's because of what he did that we were able to trap the British, cut months off the revolution, save countless scores of lives. James Armistead, hero. We just haven't heard these guys before. So there's so much of our history we don't hear, and I don't say this lightly. I've been appointed by a number of state boards of education in several states to help write the history and government standard for students in those states. I know it's in the textbooks, but I also know it's in history because we've got so much of the stuff, we read so many of the older books. And so as you go back to John Adams, why would John Adams point to preachers and say, well, these are the guys that we can look to that were so influential in American independence? Well, it's because when you read the Declaration of Independence, and by the way, that's a great thing to do, is read the Declaration of Independence. Rarely do we do that. We're often told that the Founding Fathers did the Declaration of Independence because taxation without representation. That's why they birthed America. They didn't like what was going on economically, so taxation without representation, here we are today. That's okay as far as it goes, but the problem is the Declaration of Independence listed 27 reasons that they separated from Great Britain. Taxation without representation was issue number 17 out of the 27. It didn't even make the top half of what concerned them, and that's the only one we focus on. We have so bored into economics being everything that a nation is that we've missed so many of the moral and religious aspects that have been out there really for centuries. So when you look at the Declaration of Independence, you look at those 27 clauses, you look at the rights that are set forth in the Declaration of Independence. Historians have documented that every right set forth in the Declaration of Independence had been preached from the American pulpit prior to 1763. And you know what that means? That means the Declaration of Independence is nothing more than a listing of the sermons that we've been hearing in church for the last couple of decades leading up to the Revolution. That's what the Declaration is. And so when you look at these individuals that we celebrate on the 4th of July that gave us this Declaration of Independence, our birth certificate, it's kind of fun to see how they got their start. If you'll go to any public library or just go online, you can read the records of Congress, the records of everything that's gone on in Congress. And if you'll go back to page 1, you'll see the very first time that these founding fathers got together. The very first session of the very first Congress of the United States, September the 6th, 1774. And if you'll read the records of Congress, you'll say, oh, look, they opened with prayer. And you keep reading, you say, that wasn't a dinky little prayer, was it? No, it wasn't. According to historical records, some records indicate that the opening prayer session in Congress ran up to 3 hours long, just in the opening prayer session in Congress. Now, it was such a significant time, and so many delegates wrote about it, that you take someone like Silas Deane, he said that after that time of prayer in Congress, he said even the stern old Quakers had tears running down their cheeks. And the Quakers are the least likely to cry. That's why they're called the stern old Quakers. Even they were crying after that time of prayer in Congress. And it wasn't just a time of prayer. You see, John Adams specifically said that in Congress that morning, he told Abigail, he said in Congress that morning they had Bible study. They studied 4 chapters of the Bible that morning in Congress. And he said that God so spoke to them in 1 chapter. God so changed what they saw by reading that 1 chapter out of the 4 that they had the faith that, maybe we can defeat the British in the coming conflict. So he wrote a letter to Abigail, and he said, Abigail, you got to see this chapter that we had this morning in Congress. And he told her very, very bluntly, he said, Abigail, I must beg you to read that psalm. He said, read the 35th Psalm to your friends, and then read it to your father. See, Psalm 35 is what God really used to change their whole perspective that morning. And he said, Abigail, I want you to read it, then I want you to show it to all your friends, then I want you to show it to your dad. And her father was the minister of their church, Reverend William Smith, who was preacher of their church. He said, you got to let everybody know what we did in the Congress this morning with the 35th Psalm. Man, we didn't know they had a Bible study, much less that God spoke to them out of that Bible study. And on top of that, he said, Abigail, that's not all. He said, Abigail, he said, we've appointed a continental fast. We've got 3 million people in America back then, and we've called all of them to a day of fasting and prayer. And he expected good things, as he told her. He says millions would be upon their knees at once before their great Creator, imploring His forgiveness and blessings, His smiles on American council and arms. He said, can you imagine the impact of having 3 million Americans, the whole nation, pray and fast before God? Now, that started a tradition of congressional prayer proclamations. It was the first of 15 congressional prayer proclamations, and that proclamation was for a time of fasting, humiliation, and prayer. We got real needs, so we're serious about going to God and say, God, we humble ourselves and we're fasting and praying. We got to have your intervention. Well, if you're going to be proper about the thing, you expect God to answer your prayers. When you get serious about praying, you want God to answer. And if you're really going to be respectful toward God when He does answer, you need to remember to say thank you for answering our prayers. And that's why you'll find that just a few months after the time of fasting, humiliation, and prayer, Congress said, we need a time of prayer and thanksgiving. You remember all those things we prayed and fasted about? God answered those prayers. So we're calling the nation to have a time of prayer and thanksgiving. Thank God for answering all those prayers. And then a few months later, they say, we got all these needs going now, so we need another day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer, which they did. And then a few months later, they said, you remember all that praying and fasting we did? God answered the prayers. Let's have another day of prayer and thanksgiving. 15 times throughout the American Revolution, it alternated between a time of prayer and fasting and prayer and thanksgiving, and prayer and fasting, and prayer 15 times. And we saw God weigh in such miraculous ways so often, just so many ways that just defy logic and explanation, except God did it, that by 1778, our commander-in-chief, George Washington, who's on the ground seeing all these battles, it was obvious to him as well. 1778, George Washington declared this. He said, the hand of providence has been so conspicuous in all this that he must be worse than an infidel that lacks faith, and more than wicked that hath not gratitude enough to acknowledge his obligations. If you can't stop and see what God has done and thank Him, if you can't acknowledge your obligations to thank God for what He's done, you got to be worse than an infidel. You got to be flat wicked if you cannot see what God has done and acknowledge your obligations to thank Him for what He's done. See, that was the tone, and that's what we saw throughout, and that's what is in their official writings. And that's why when you get to 1781, which is the end of the American Revolution, the final major battle of the American Revolution, the Battle of Yorktown, that's when the British lay down their arms. They say, okay, we give up. Now, that's a significant time because at that point in time, we're no longer under the laws of the British. We're out from under the British kings. We no longer have a monarch. We have now proven that we have an independent nation. It's been established even through that conflict. So what makes that significant is being out from under the laws of the kings. One of the laws the kings had passed was a very simple law, been passed decades earlier. It says if you live in an English-speaking colony, America, you cannot print any Bible in the English language. Now, we printed Bibles in every other language. 1661, John Eliot, the Apostle to the Indians, printed the first Bible in America, but it was in the Massachusetts Indian language. We printed Bibles in Massachusetts, in Cherokee and Shawnee, and Ojibwe. We printed them in Russian, French, Italian, Latin, Spanish, you name it. We printed it in every language there was except English, because by British law we could not do that. But having whipped the British at Yorktown, we're not under that law anymore, so now we can print our first English language Bible. Within a month of Yorktown, the plans advanced to print that first English language Bible. 11 months later, that Bible rolled off the presses. Now, it's become one of the rarest books in the world. When it rolled off the presses in 1782, they printed 20,000 copies of that first English language Bible. Today there's only 29 left in the world. I have one. Library of Congress has one. I don't carry the original with me because it's just too delicate, but I carry a duplicate. This is what it looks like. First Bible printed in the English language in America. The original you see here, this is the Bible, 1782. This is called the Bible of the American Revolution. You know what's significant about this Bible? First Bible printed in English in America? You know who printed it? The Congress of the United States printed this. Whoa, time out. The Founding Fathers printed the first Bible in English in America? Why would they do that? They tell us, and the records of Congress included here, they tell us that this Bible is, quote, a neat edition of the Holy Scriptures for the use of our schools, end quote. I thought they didn't want the Bible in schools. Let's go back to the first public school law ever passed in America, 1647, passed in Connecticut, passed in Massachusetts. Do you know what the title of the first public school law in America was? It was called the Old Deluder Satan Act. It was called that because it says it being the one chief project that an old deluder Satan to keep us from the knowledge of the Scriptures as he has in former times. Since Satan's number one purpose is to keep us out of the Scriptures, we're not letting it happen in America. That's why we're starting public schools. For the next 320 years, the Bible was part of public education in America, hands down. The first time it was not was on June the 17th of 1963 when the Supreme Court issued a double decision in Abbott and Shimp and Murray Corlett where they said, you know, this thing about the Bible in schools anymore, we're not going to do that. You know, for 320 years we did. What we think today is we think the way it's been for the last 50 years is the way it's always been. No, not by a long shot. This Bible by itself proves it. Do you know that Bible even had a congressional endorsement in front of it? That Bible said, resolved, the United States and Congress assembled recommend this edition of the Bible to the inhabitants of the United States. This is in the American Revolution? Yes, it was not a secular revolution. In every aspect, we tried to keep God, we tried to acknowledge God, we tried to see the principles, we tried to keep the Scriptures there. And even when we signed the peace treaty the next year in 1783, and by the way, the four people you see on the peace treaty signatures there, the guy on the right, halfway off the screen, is David Hartley, the British ambassador. Moving from right to left, you see the three Americans, Ben Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay. Those are the four that signed the treaty. If you want to see the treaty, you go to Washington, D.C., to the State Department, you go up on the 6th floor of the John Quincy Adams State Drawing Room, and you get to see the treaty. And if you look at the treaty, you'll see the four wax seals. See on the bottom left there, David Hartley, the British ambassador, then John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, and you see at the top left, there's 10 articles to the treaty that established American independence. We declared it with the Declaration. We established it with this peace treaty. And by the way, look at the title the Founding Fathers put on the peace treaty. See the title on the top right? In the name of the most holy and undivided Trinity. I could be wrong, but that sounds Christian to me. They say, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, a Trinitarian invocation, in the name of the most holy and undivided Trinity. And today we're told, oh no, they wouldn't want under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. They wouldn't want in God we trust out in public. Really? When they have acknowledgments like that on official documents, it was that way throughout the American Revolution. And John Adams, who saw it, John Adams, who signed not only the Declaration, but he's one of only three that signed the peace treaty 8 years later. John Adams said it as clearly as could be said. The general principles on which the Fathers achieved independence were the general principles of Christianity. Now, we spend a lot of time today saying, no, he didn't know what he was talking about. I love collecting articles from professors and others. Here's one that ran recently, Stephen Moores, who said the Founding Fathers were not Christians. I don't care what John Adams said, he doesn't know what he's talking about. I love it that 200 years later, we're so much smarter than the guys who were actually there, who actually saw it, But we got PhDs, so we know what we're talking about. They didn't have PhDs. So we get articles like this, and here's the LA Times. The LA Times says America's unchristian beginnings. They said the Founding Fathers were deists who rejected the divinity of Jesus. Whole chain of newspapers out on the East Coast ran this article, said the authors of the Declaration were enemies of Christ. And I speak at law schools and universities across the nation. Last several years, the most widely used book I've seen has been one called The Godless Constitution. We specifically tell the next generation of Americans that America has lasted this long because we've been secular from the beginning. We have a godless constitution, and that's why we've been such a great nation. Now, how do we know it's a godless constitution? Because as you just saw in the articles, all the Founding Fathers who wrote it were all godless. I mean, the Founding Fathers were atheists and agnostics and deists, and you can't expect a bunch of secular guys to give you something religious. No, godless founders give you a godless constitution. Now, a lot of people buy into that, and I was recently at a major law school, a very prestigious law school, and I put up the picture of the 56 signers of the Declaration. I said, students, all these postgraduate kids in law school, I said, who do you recognize up there? And everyone instantly found Thomas Jefferson, everyone instantly found Benjamin Franklin. And that's exactly where it stopped. And I said, no, wait a minute. There's 56 up there, and you found 2? Give me some of the others. And I said, let's just go across the front row. You point out to me which one of these guys is Richard Henry Lee, which one is George Clinton, which one is Sam Adams. Just continue across the front row. Which one is Charles Carroll, and which one is Robert Morris, and which one is Benjamin Rush. And let's go back up to the second row. Which one is Stephen Hopkins, and which one is William Williams. And back to the front row, the guy leaning on his arm, that's Elbridge Gerry, and right beside him is Robert Treat Paine. And I just go through the other 54 names, and they say, who? We've never heard of those names before. Isn't it interesting that we've all been trained to recognize the 2 least religious Founding Fathers? We can find Jefferson, we can find Franklin, we can't find any others, but it doesn't matter. They're all like Jefferson and Franklin anyway. Really? Do you know out of the 56 guys who signed the Declaration of Independence, 29 of them had seminary degrees? That's not bad for a bunch of atheists to have seminary degrees, and apparently that's what we had going on back then. See, we used to know better than that. We would never have bought into the fact that they were secular or they wanted a secular nation because we knew our history too well. There's actually a great history book that was printed in 1848 that we used in public schools for generations. It's called Lives of the Signers of the Declaration of Independence. We've actually reprinted that, but it has 4, 5, 6 pages on every one of those 56 signers. And in public schools for years, we knew everyone. We knew their faith, we knew their character, we knew all about them, but we don't today. See, folks we don't talk about today include folks like signer of the Declaration, John Witherspoon. Now, John Witherspoon, one of the most prominent signers of the Declaration, he served on over 100 committees in Congress, including the Board of War. He's George Washington's boss in the Revolution. He's also the president of Princeton University. He's also the best-known gospel evangelist in American history back then, has more than a dozen volumes of published gospel sermons. Americans couldn't wait for his next volume of sermons to come out. And he's also responsible for 2 American editions of the Bible, including this one right here. This is original from 1791. This is done by Dr. John Witherspoon, signer of the Declaration. This is considered America's very first family Bible. He did this Bible so that families could have Bible studies together. Now, because he is such a well-known founder back then, he has numerous writings. And if you read his writings, you'll find statements like this. He says, I entreat you in the most earnest manner to believe in Jesus Christ, for there is no salvation in any other. Acts 4:12. If you're not reconciled to God through Jesus Christ, if you're not clothed with the spotless robe of his righteousness, you must forever perish. That sounds kind of evangelical to me. I mean, I'm not used to atheists talking like this, and apparently he's one of our atheist founding fathers. You know, other founding fathers we don't talk about include Charles Thompson. Charles Thompson, Thompson was one of only 2 guys who signed the original Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July. It was the 19th of July that the founders got an idea and said, why don't we create a declaration we can all sign? So on the 2nd of August is when they signed the one that we see and celebrate. But the 4th of July, Charles Thompson was one of the only 2 who signed it. But Charles Thompson is also a theologian. He's responsible for this work right here. This is the original. This is called Thompson's Bible. You can still get this in Christian bookstores today. Now, not to be confused with Thompson's Chain Reference Bible. That's Thompson. This is Thomson. This is the first translation of the Greek Septuagint into English. It took Charles 25 years to make this translation, and we still sell it today as one of the most scholarly of American translations of the Bible. And he was very outspoken about his faith as well. He says very simply, I am a Christian. I believe only in the Scriptures and in Jesus Christ, my Savior. That's kind of pointed. I mean, that's just real simple, real succinct. And then you have founding fathers like Dr. Benjamin Rush. He is certainly one of my favorite founding fathers. We don't study him much anymore, but when he died in 1813, the other founders still alive, like John Adams, said Benjamin Rush is one of the three most notable founding fathers. John Adams said, you got George Washington, Ben Franklin, and Benjamin Rush, and we don't have a clue who this guy is today. And he had such an impact on America. You see, among other things, he started 5 universities. 3 of them still go today. He's called the father of public schools under the Constitution. He did the first faith-based prison movement in America. He's the leader of the civil rights movement. He started the first abolition society in America. He helped found the first black denomination in America, the AME denomination. On top of that, he served in 3 presidential administrations. He is called the father of American medicine. 3,000 students got their medical degree with his signature on the diploma. He started the American College of Physicians. I can go through all the stuff he did. You know, we knew exactly who Benjamin Rush was, but we don't today. And because of that, we have no clue that this is the man who started the Sunday school movement in America. Did you know a signer of the Declaration of Independence started the Sunday school movement in America? He's also the man who penned this work right here. This is the Constitution for the very first Bible society ever done in America. Now, why would he start a Bible society? He tells us. He says, if we can get Americans to read the Bible, he said 2 things will happen. Number 1, they'll become Christians. They'll find out how to have a personal relationship with God through Jesus Christ. He said, number 2, if we can get them to read the Bible and obey what they read in the Bible, he said, we'll solve all of our social problems. We won't have crime. We won't have slavery. He went through all the things we wouldn't have. So he wants a Bible in the hand of every American. And in looking to get a Bible in the hands of every American, he came up with a new way to print books. It's called stereotyped printing. It's an early form of mass production. But here's the result. This is the first stereotyped Bible ever done in the history of the United States. It's done by signer of the Declaration, Dr. Benjamin Rush. This is the Bible designed that you could buy it cheap and give it out to your friends. This is what you use to get them to read the Scriptures and bring them to Christ. And because he is such a well-known political figure, every generation knew him. He has so many writings, and if you read his writings, he is so out front about his Christian faith. You find statements like this. He said, my only hope of salvation is the infinite, transcendent love of God manifested to the world by the death of his Son upon the cross. He says, nothing but his blood will wash away my sins. I rely exclusively upon it. Come, Lord Jesus, come quickly. Pretty good doctrine for an atheist. But see, again, he's one of the top 3 founders. We don't even know him today. We've learned to teach the exception and not the rule. We can talk about the 2, but we won't talk about the 54. Another founder that we say very little about today is Francis Hopkinson. Now, Francis Hopkins is a really cool guy. Francis Hopkinson was one of the very first federal judges appointed by George Washington. Francis Hopkinson is also the man who designed the American flag. So, flag back there is the product of Francis Hopkinson. He's the guy who designed our American flag and allowed us to have that thing where we can keep adding stars up there. Francis Hopkinson was also a church music director, a choir leader, and an organist, and he is responsible for this work here. This is from 1767. This is America's first purely American hymn book. What signer of the Declaration Francis Hopkinson did was he took the entire book of Psalms and set the entire book of Psalms to music so that we could sing the Psalms like David had sung the Psalms thousands of years earlier. Now, can you imagine setting the entire book of Psalms to music? I mean, for that matter, can you imagine just setting Psalms 119 to music? And that would seem to be a life project. And if you did get Psalms 119 set to music, how many church services would it take you to sing Psalms 119? I'll point out that in this hymn book, he set Psalms 119 to music, and that hymn is 62 pages long in the hymn book. One hymn that he did, 62 pages long. Well, in addition to Francis Hopkinson, we have founding fathers like Sam Adams. Sam Adams, you recognize, he's the father of the American Revolution and went to be the governor of Massachusetts. He has so many public papers. You read his papers, you find declarations like this. I rely on the merits of Jesus Christ for pardon of all my sins. Very simple, very succinct. You also have founding fathers like Roger Sherman. Roger Sherman, one of my favorite founding fathers. He is the only founding father to sign all 4 founding documents. He signed the Declaration, the Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, and the Articles of Association. No other founder signed all the documents. He is called the master builder of the Constitution. He's the guy who came up with the bicameral system that we have with the House and the Senate. He's also a framer of the Bill of Rights. He's the guy who got George Washington to do our very first federal Thanksgiving proclamation. In Congress, he went through the Bible verses explaining why, now that we're a federal nation, we ought to have a Thanksgiving proclamation. Just a really cool guy. He's a judge. He's the mayor of New Haven, Connecticut. He's a surveyor. He's all sorts of stuff. He's also a theologian for his denomination in the state of Connecticut. He actually wrote the denominational creed for his denomination, and that's why he's a theologian. And if you read his writings, you find statements like this: God commands all men everywhere to repent. He also commands them to believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and assured us that all who do repent and believe shall be saved. God has promised to bestow eternal blessings on all those who are willing to accept him on the terms of the gospel, that is, in a way of free grace through the atonement. That's pretty Orthodox Christianity. And by the way, he was a long-term member of Congress, served for years and years. Here's actually a newspaper article. You see it dated 1837, talking about Roger Sherman. It says, the volume which he consulted more than any other was the Bible. It was his custom at the commencement of every session of Congress to purchase a copy of the Scriptures, to peruse it daily, and to present it to one of his children on his return. Roger Sherman, like so many of the Founding Fathers, believed that you should read through the Bible from cover to cover once a year. Now, that's a good practice for all of us to do. But he would do it, and every year when he went to Congress, he'd get a new copy of the Bible, and as he would read it day by day, he'd make notes out in the margins as he's going through it. And when he got home, he'd give it to one of his kids. And it did take him a while to get to all of his kids. He had 15 kids, so he had to read the Bible through a lot of times to get a Bible to every kid. But that was a practice, read through the Bible once a year. So Roger Sherman's a founder we don't talk much about. He's a very significant founder. John Adams, we do know something about, because John Adams, again, we're starting to recapture knowledge of him, but we don't know much about his faith anymore, but we should. It's all over his letters. As a matter of fact, I brought an original John Adams letter. If you've never seen one by John Adams, there it is. It's here. And I just want to read you part of what's in this simple John Adams letter. You see the letter right here. I'm just going to read off the bottom part here, the bottom paragraph. You can see the first three words. This is the Holy Ghost. See that? Here's what he says. He says, the Holy Ghost carries on the whole Christian system and his truth. Not a baptism, not a marriage, not a sacrament can be administered but by the Holy Ghost. He says, there is no authority, civil or religious. There can be no legitimate government but what is administered by the Holy Ghost. There can be no salvation without it. All without is rebellion and perdition, or in more orthodox words, damnation. I don't think I saw that on the TV specials with John Adams recently. You know, they managed to keep faith completely out of Adams. And you can't do that if you read his writings. And you want to find somebody who is a real Bible thumper, you read the writings of Abigail Adams. Abigail's letters are online. I mean, she is so passionate about Christ, and she told John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams, her young son, is going overseas. He's received a congressional diplomatic appointment. He's going over there. He's 11 years old, going overseas on his first diplomatic mission. And she tells John Quincy, she said, you know how I've raised you. You know how you've been raised in church and with the Scriptures. You've been taught Scriptures. You've been taught morality. It is so important that my prayer is that if you're going to get to Europe, if you're going to get to France and act immoral, if you're going to get there and give up your faith, I pray that God would sink you in the ocean and drown you before you get to France if you're going to give up your faith. Whoa! And she is really passionate about Christianity and faith and how important it is, and how important it is to maintain that relationship with Christ. We never hear that about John Adams at all. And you have founding fathers like Charles Carroll. Charles Carroll of Carrollton is not only a signer of the Declaration, he is also a framer of the Bill of Rights. And he was very outspoken about the role that Christ had played in the founding of the nation. Matter of fact, this is one of his statements. He says, I'm grateful to Almighty God for the blessings which, through Jesus Christ our Lord, He's conferred on my beloved country. See, we're told today, oh no, we're not a Christian nation. No. History says we were. They were proud of the fact we were. And by the way, see, they get it all wrong. Did they say a Christian nation? That's exclusive. No, no, no. A Christian nation is the one nation that allows other religions to come and be there. You see, we had Jews in America in synagogues in 1654. We had Muslims in America in 1619. We're doing Qurans in America in the early 1800s. We had Buddhist temples in America in the early 1800s. It was all back there. Well, how can you be a Christian nation and have all these other religions? It's really simple. We believe as Christians that if you'll just share the truth will win out. The Holy Spirit will take it. We're not scared of other religions. We're just like Elijah on top of Mount Carmel. 400 false prophets of God, 450 prophets of Baal. It's 850 to 1. He says, you guys practice your faith all you want to. Take all the time you want. He said, just make sure I get my shot at it. See, that's what we believe, is when you put it in a free market setting, Christianity is going to win out every time. That's why in a true Christian nation, you have religious freedom. You have religious tolerance. You have the rights of conscience. Secular nations do not do that. We better stay a Christian nation if we want to enjoy religious freedom for all people, all places. It's just... The whole concept of free market, even as applied to economics, comes out of the Bible. 1 Timothy 5:8, 2 Thessalonians 3:10. If we're not a Christian nation, we'll lose a free market form of capitalism. All the things that we've come to accept, we think that that's secular. No, it came out of the Bible. These guys knew it and they talked about it. It's just that we don't talk about our history anymore. As long as we stay a Christian nation, everyone else will be welcome here. We'll continue to protect the rights of everyone. That only happens when you have a Christian nation. Doesn't happen with other religions, does not happen with secular. It happens with Christian. Well, continuing to go through, you see these kind of declarations. By the way, Charles Carroll was the final surviving signer of the Declaration to die. He died at the age of 95 years old. He outlived his kids. He outlived his grandkids. I mean, he lived a long time. And somebody asked him, said, Charles, you will die someday. And when you do die, are you ready to meet God when you die? He answered that with this letter. This is his handwritten letter. Charles Carroll of Carrollton, same way he signed the Declaration. You can see the letter up here. It's dated up top, 1825, which makes him 89 years old at that point. The question is, are you ready to meet God when you die? And he's got a very clear answer right here. He says, of course I am. He says, on the mercy of my Redeemer, I rely for salvation, and on his merits, not on the works I've done in obedience to his precepts. That's Ephesians 2:8-9. By grace you saved through faith, not of works, lest any man should boast. Real simple. And I can go through others like this. I've got their letters. It's online. The stuff is posted. You can see it. And we're told that, oh no, the signers of the Declaration were enemies of Christ. And how is that possible? It's possible because we don't know who they are. We're told that these are the guys who gave us a godless Constitution. How can that be? Now, this particular book is written by Cramnick and Moore, two professors at Cornell University. I've shown you some original documents this morning. There are so many more. The Library of Congress has a huge display of these original religious documents. Library of Congress has put it all out there. There's so many documents out there. How can these two professors claim that all the founders were atheists and agnostics and deists? This is where it's important. In every academic book, go to the back of the book and look at the footnotes. Look at the sources they have. So we go look at the sources in the back of this college textbook, and they tell us right up front, we have dispensed with the usual scholarly apparatus of footnotes. Isn't that interesting? This is revisionism, and this is how it works. We make claims. We don't have to document them. We'll just go in the media and say, oh, no, America's not a Christian nation. We don't have to document that. We'll just keep saying it until everybody believes it. See, and that's what happens with this whole notion. When we know who we are, when we know our history, we have a completely different response. As a matter of fact, we've been very blessed as a nation. No question about that. Blessed is that nation whose God is the Lord. When you look at our foundations and our history, even though there's warts and blemishes and things were done wrong, we still tried more than any other nation in that era to apply biblical principles where we could. And God blessed that. He responded to that. But we're also told in the scriptures that if the foundations be destroyed, what shall the righteous do? So what are the foundations? Because the foundations have to be protected from generation to generation. If we lose those foundations, we'll lose the whole building that sits on top of that foundation. So what are the foundations? Well, I think George Washington properly identified them. Now remember, George Washington, father of his country, gave 45 years of his adult life into public service. Military service. He presided over the convention that wrote the Constitution. He signed the Constitution. He presided over the framing of the Bill of Rights. He's the first president for 2 terms, and then he resigns. He's now an old man. After 45 years of public service, he gives his farewell address. And in that address, he reminds Americans, he said, guys, we need to remember what brought us here. We need to remember what's made us different from all the other nations across Europe and the rest of the world. We have to remember what our foundations are. And so he reminded us very clearly in that farewell address. He said, of all the habits and dispositions that lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. If you want your politics to prosper, the two things you will not separate will be religion and morality. If you want politics and government to work well, if you want American exceptionalism, if you want the government to do right, if you want prosperity, if you want all this, then you won't separate religion and morality from political life. Now, that was such a strong belief that he even went further with an added sentence. And I would suggest that George Washington clearly is a patriot. No question about it. I think he knows a patriot when he sees one, because he was surrounded with a Valley Forge and throughout the American Revolution. He gave us a litmus test for patriotism. Very next sentence, this is what he said. He said, in vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars. He said, anyone who tries to remove religion and morality from public life, I don't let them call themselves a patriot because they're trying to destroy the country. That's pretty serious stuff that he's talking about. Now, I will tell you, We used to read George Washington's farewell address. It's considered the most significant political address ever delivered by any U.S. president. You will find that, for example, in the war between the states, President Lincoln even set aside a whole day and said, all right, I want the entire Union Army doing nothing but reading George Washington's farewell address on this day. In World War I, Woodrow Wilson set aside a day, had the entire American Army just study Washington's farewell address. We had it in every college textbook. We had it in every high school government textbook. We studied this because it was the map. It showed us how we'd become what we were and what we had to do to preserve it. We haven't seen this in a textbook in 40 years. It's gone away. And he says the only thing that makes our politics prosper is to keep religion and morality part of what we do, and don't let anyone call themselves a patriot if they try to separate that. So religion and morality are indispensable foundations. That's what we have to preserve. And see, as we look at a 4th of July kind of a celebration time, it's fun to celebrate, but there's responsibilities that go with that as well. I think one of the great responsibilities was put forth by a man named Matthias Burnett. That's on how to preserve the foundations. Matthias Burnett was a famous preacher in Connecticut, and you may not be aware of this, but it used to be a tradition in America that we opened state legislative sessions by having a joint session of the state legislature. We got the House and the Senate, the governor, lieutenant governor, got them all together, and we brought in a preacher to speak to the entire state government. Well, in 1803, he's the one who spoke to the Connecticut legislature. And what had happened was they just had their elections, so they had all the new representatives, all the new senators, everybody is there, the whole Congress of Connecticut, they're all there. And after having addressed them, he then looks up to all the citizens up in the gallery. All the citizens are there, and this is what he told the citizens. He said, citizens, he said, to God and posterity, you're accountable for your rights and your rulers. Now, I think today a lot of Christians would say, I'm not accountable for my rulers. I didn't even vote last election. Exactly. You see, we've been given a stewardship with the vote that we've been given by God. He said, here's the vote. You take care of this till I get back. It's Matthew 25. It's Luke 19. It's the parable of the minas and the talents. We've been given that. He says, I'm giving you a vote. You take care of it till I get back. Come back. We'll have to answer for what we did with the vote, whether we used it or not, and how we used it, how we invested it. If we invested it wrong, we're going to be in trouble with the guy who gave us our vote, and that's God Almighty. We have a responsibility to God, but notice what else he said. He said, you're responsible not only to God, but you're responsible also to posterity. Now, posterity means generations yet unborn, generations yet to come. And this is talking about the future, what's on out there. And this is where we start getting into eschatology. And you know what eschatology is, study the end time. I love eschatology. I studied it for years and years. And you know all the different views. You can be pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib, pan-trib, on-trib, premillennial, post-millennial. You've got all the views. There's nothing that divides Christianity into more belief segments than eschatology. And I get emails from people all the time say, Barton, we appreciate what you're trying to do, but you do realize it's a waste of time. We're in the last days, it's all prophesied, nothing you can do to change it. And I get those kind of emails, and you know, that may be true. And I don't care what eschatological belief system you come from, everybody still has to deal with the very simple command given by Jesus in Luke 19:13, where he said, occupy till I come. I hope Jesus Christ comes back today and screws up every plan I've got. But just in case he doesn't, what do I leave for the next generation? What kind of stewardship have I? We've been given blessings that no other nation in the history of the world has ever experienced. But they're not there because we had them last generation. They're only there because we maintain them from generation to generation. And that's why he said, to God and posterity, you're accountable for your rights and your rulers. Let not your children have reason to curse you for giving up those rights and prostrating those institutions which your fathers delivered to you. We are the stewards of the country, and as we celebrate, and this is a great time to celebrate another birthday, well over 230 years we've been celebrating this, we have to remember that we have a responsibility to preserve the foundations, and they are religion and morality, and we have to preserve them in public life. We have to apply that for the people we elect, from dog catcher through President of the United States. We have to apply the same biblical standards if God is going to bless the nation. God bless you guys. Thanks for letting me share.